The wind did not howl, not tonight. It merely breathed, a long, drawn-out exhalation that seemed to originate from the very curvature of the earth, sweeping across the endless white expanse of the pack ice to press its weight against the wooden slats of the cabin. It was a sound of immense, crushing distance. There was no anger in it, only a persistent, hollow presence that filled the void between the stars and the snow. Inside the small structure, which felt more like a wooden crate adrift in a sea of frozen milk than a shelter, the air was still. It was heavy with the scent of kerosene and old wool, a stale, preserved atmosphere that held the cold at bay only by the slightest of margins. The temperature was not warm, it was simply survivable. The frost had long ago claimed the corners of the room, creeping inward along the floorboards in delicate, feathery patterns that mimicked the very specimens the botanist sought to document. He sat at the desk, a heavy construct of oak that had traveled thousands of miles from a greener, softer world to rest here, in the heart of the great white silence. The wood was cold to the touch. Even through the thick, fingerless wool of his gloves, he could feel the latent chill of the timber, a seep of temperature that seemed to drain the heat from his bones. The desk was cluttered, yet organized with the meticulous, almost desperate precision of a man who knows that order is the only defense against the chaos of the Arctic night. There were jars of thick glass, their contents suspended in clear, viscous fluid. There were stacks of paper, heavy and textured, their edges slightly curled from the dampness that pervaded everything. And there were the pencils. A row of them, sharpened to lethal points, resting in a tin tray that rattled imperceptibly whenever a particularly strong gust of wind buffeted the eastern wall. The light in the room came from a single lantern. It was a brass instrument, tarnished by time and salt air, hanging from a hook in the low ceiling. The flame within was small, a fragile tongue of orange and yellow that fought a silent, losing battle against the shadows. It cast a warm, dim glow over the desk, creating a circle of visibility that barely extended beyond the botanist's hands. Outside this circle, the room dissolved into deep, velvety grays and blues, the colors of a charcoal sketch on dark paper. The shadows were not black. They were heavy, textured shades of slate and indigo, blurring the edges of the bunk, the stove, and the heavy trunk that sat by the door. The light caught the rough grain of the wooden walls, highlighting the grooves and knots, turning the timber into a landscape of ridges and valleys. It caught the fibers of the botanist's coat, a heavy, rough-spun garment that smelled of peat and smoke. He did not move. To move was to disturb the layer of warmed air that clung to his skin. He sat in a stillness that mirrored the world outside, his breath visible in the dim light as faint, rhythmic clouds of vapor. In and out, in and out. The rhythm was slow, a biological metronome ticking away the seconds of the long night. He watched the steam of his own life rise and dissipate into the upper shadows of the room, vanishing before it could reach the frost-lined ceiling. It was a meditation on transience. Here in this place of permanent ice, life was a fleeting, vaporous thing, easily extinguished, easily forgotten. Only the ice remained. Only the ice remembered. His eyes, tired and rimmed with red from the smoke of the stove, drifted to the window. It was a small aperture, hardly larger than a book, and it was entirely opaque. The glass was thick, but the frost was thicker. It had bloomed across the pane in layers, a geological accumulation of frozen moisture. There were swirls and ferns, jagged peaks and soft, rolling dunes of white crystal. It was a garden of ice, growing in the dark, fed by the humidity of his breath and the biting cold of the exterior world. The botanist studied it. This was his subject now. The true flowers of the north were not the stunted, hardy saxifrages that bloomed for a few weeks in the brief, blinding summer. The true flowers were these, the flowers of the frost. They were structural, geometric, perfect in their lifeless symmetry. They required no sun, no soil, only the absence of heat. He reached out a hand, his movements slow and deliberate as if moving through water. He adjusted the wick of the lantern. The flame flared briefly, sending a spasm of shadows dancing across the walls before settling back into a steady, golden hum. The light shifted on the desk, illuminating a sheet of paper. It was a dark, gray-toned paper, chosen specifically for this work. White paper was useless here. It was too stark, too bright. The gray absorbed the light, allowing him to build the image up from the darkness, using white chalk and pale pastel to capture the ghost-like quality of the ice. He picked up a stick of white pastel. It was cool and dry, a piece of compressed dust that held the potential of 1,000 snowflakes. He held it suspended over the paper, his hand hovering, hesitating. The hesitation was not born of uncertainty, but of reverence. In this silence, every action felt significant. Every mark on the paper was a permanent alteration of the universe. To draw was to speak, and in the Arctic, one spoke only when necessary. He looked back at the window, studying the pattern of the frost. He chose a specific section, a cluster of crystalline fronds that spiraled outward from the center of the pane. It looked like a fern from a prehistoric forest, frozen in time, turned to glass. He needed to understand its architecture. He needed to see how the main stem branched into smaller veins, how the veins dissolved into delicate, needle-like tips. He narrowed his eyes, the lantern light reflecting in his pupils, turning them into tiny, golden mirrors. The wind sighed again outside, a longer, deeper sound this time. It shifted slightly, coming more from the north, carrying with it the promise of lower temperatures. The timbers of the cabin groaned in response, a low wooden complaint that vibrated through the floor and up through the legs of the chair. The botanist shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking softly. He felt the cold seeping through the soles, a reminder that the floor was merely a thin barrier between him and the frozen earth. He curled his toes inside the wool socks, seeking warmth, finding only the dull numbness that had become his constant companion. He did not mind the cold. It was a purifying force. It stripped away the superfluous, the unnecessary. It reduced the world to its elemental state, solid, gas, silence. He brought the pastel down to the paper. The first touch was tentative, a mere whisper of white against the gray. The sound of the chalk on the textured paper was loud in the quiet room, a dry, scratching sound like the legs of an insect on dry leaves. Scritch, scritch. He drew a line. It was the central spine of the frost fern. He drew it slowly, his hand trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the intensity of his focus. The line was not straight. Nothing in nature was truly straight. It wavered, it thickened and thinned, mimicking the organic growth of the ice crystal. He paused, lifting the pastel, and looked at the mark he had made. It stood out starkly against the dark background, a single thread of light in the gloom. He exhaled, a long plume of white vapor obscuring the paper for a moment. He waited for it to clear. Time here was not measured in hours or minutes, but in these small cycles. The breath, the cloud, the clearing, the wind, the silence, the wind, the scratching of the chalk, the pause, the scratching. He was a part of this cycle now. He was no longer an intruder from the south. He was a component of the winter. He dipped the pastel again, pressing harder this time, building the density of the white. He began to add the branches, the delicate arms of the frost fern reaching out into the gray void of the paper. He worked from the center outward, just as the frost had grown on the glass. The lantern hissed softly, burning a fraction of an ounce of oil. The smell was comforting, a hydrocarbon tether to civilization. He remembered the smell of the library and the university, the scent of old glue and leather bindings. That world felt like a dream now, a vivid, noisy hallucination. This here was reality. The wood, the ice, the scratch of the chalk. He focused on the texture of the frost. It was not smooth. It was granular, made up of millions of microscopic prisms. He tried to capture that texture with the side of the pastel stick, dragging it lightly across the tooth of the paper. The result was a scattering of white dust, a nebulous haze that suggested the fragility of the ice. It was pleasing. It was accurate. He stopped to sharpen the pastel. He used a small penknife, the blade worn thin from years of use. He shaved the chalk carefully, letting the white dust fall into a small brass bowl he kept for this purpose. The dust piled up like miniature snowdrifts. He would not waste it. Later, he would use his finger to smudge the dust onto the paper, creating the soft, glowing background of the frost fog. The scraping of the knife was rhythmic. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It merged with the sound of the wind, creating a slow, hypnotic duet. He watched the white flakes fall, mesmerized by their gravity. Even the smallest particle obeyed the laws of physics. Even here, at the end of the world, gravity held true. His gaze wandered around the room again, seeking a break from the intensity of the white line. He looked at the heavy wool blanket on his bunk. It was a rough, gray material, standard issue, scratchy and dense. In the dim light, the folds of the blanket looked like a mountain range, a landscape of soft peaks and deep, shadowed valleys. The texture was coarse, absorbing the lantern light, drinking it in. He could almost feel the roughness of the wool against his skin, a phantom sensation. He looked at the stove, a cast iron box that radiated a sullen heat. The metal was black, pitted, stained with the ghosts of spilled soup and burnt coffee. A kettle sat on top, silent for now, the water inside tepid. He returned his attention to the drawing. The frost fern was taking shape. It was a skeletal thing, pale and ghostly against the dark paper. It looked lonely. It looked like a map of a river system on a dead planet. He decided to add depth. He picked up a piece of charcoal, a slender rod of burnt willow. It was blacker than the paper, blacker than the shadows in the corner of the room. He used it to darken the negative space around the white fronds, pushing the background further away, making the ice pop forward. The contrast was stark. The white became whiter, the gray became deeper. It was a play of chiaroscuro, a manipulation of light and dark that mimicked the world outside. There was only the white of the snow and the black of the water, the white of the moon and the black of the sky. He worked methodically, his hand moving in a small, efficient arc. He did not rush. There was no deadline. The night would last for months. The frost would not melt. He had all the time in the world. He felt a deep, abiding sense of peace settle over him. It was a heavy sensation, like a warm blanket weighing down his shoulders, slowing his heart rate. The anxiety of the early days, the fear of the dark and the isolation, had long since evaporated. It had been freeze-dried, sublimated into the air, leaving behind this crystalline calm. He was simply a recording device, an instrument of observation. The wind picked up slightly, a sudden gust that rattled the stovepipe. The draft caused the lantern flame to jump, and for a second the shadows in the room leaped and twisted, taking on strange, elongated shapes. The botanist did not look up. He was accustomed to the sudden fits of the wind. He kept his hand steady, anchoring his wrist against the edge of the desk. He was drawing the microscopic serrations on the edge of a frost leaf. It required absolute precision. He held his breath, suspending the cloud of vapor, and made 3 tiny marks, Dot, 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 he exhaled. The cloud returned. He looked at his own hand. The skin was pale, dry, cracked around the knuckles. The dirt of the charcoal had settled into the lines of his palm, mapping his lifeline in black dust. He was becoming part of the medium. Carbon and paper, flesh and bone. He flexed his fingers, feeling the stiffness in the joints. The cold was insidious. It worked its way into the cartilage, turning fluid to gel. He rubbed his hands together, the friction creating a momentary spark of heat that was quickly swallowed by the room. The sound of skin on skin was dry, papery. He picked up the white pastel again. He needed to capture the translucency of the ice. The way the light passed through it, getting trapped and scattered within the crystal lattice. This was the hardest part. It required a lightness of touch that was almost impossible with frozen fingers. He closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the structure of the water molecule. 1 oxygen, 2 hydrogen, bonded in a tetrahedron. Stacking, repeating, building the hexagonal symmetry of the snow. He opened his eyes and looked at the drawing. He saw the structure there, hidden beneath the chalk. He began to layer the white, using the side of the stick to create a glaze, a thin veil of pigment that allowed the dark paper to show through. The effect was subtle. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like a smudge, but to him it looked like glass. It looked like the thin, brittle sheet of ice that formed on the surface of the bucket of water overnight. He was satisfied. He placed the pastel back in the tray. It clicked softly against the metal. He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking in protest. He clasped his hands in his lap and stared at the drawing. It was a beginning, a small, frozen fragment of the world captured on paper. It was a testament to the fact that beauty existed even here, in the most hostile environment on Earth. He looked past the drawing, past the desk, to the shelves that lined the wall above the bunk. They were filled with books, thick leather-bound volumes with gold lettering on the spines, Flora of the North, Arctic Geology, the Journal of Captain Ross. They were silent companions, their pages full of words he had read a dozen times. He knew the texture of their paper, the smell of their binding glue. They were artifacts of a time when men thought they could conquer this place with knowledge, with maps and compasses. But the ice did not care about maps. The ice only cared about temperature. The botanist stood up slowly. His knees popped, a sharp sound in the quiet room. He walked to the stove, his heavy boots thudding dully on the floorboards. He opened the iron door of the stove with a metal hook. The fire inside was a bed of glowing red coals, pulsing gently with the draft. He picked up a piece of peat from the scuttle. It was a dense, brown block, dry and fibrous. He placed it carefully onto the coals. It began to smoke immediately, a thick, acrid smoke that smelled of ancient earth. He watched it catch fire, the blue flame licking around the edges. He closed the door, sealing the heat inside. He returned to the desk but did not sit. He stood there looking down at his work. The angle of the light was different now, casting long shadows from the pencils across the paper. The frost fern looked more three-dimensional from this height. It seemed to float above the surface of the paper, a suspended object. He felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of fatigue. It was not a physical tiredness, but a mental one. The weight of the solitude, the endless repetition of the days, or rather, the endless extension of the night, was heavy. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his wrist. He needed to sharpen more pencils. The thought was slow to form, drifting through his mind like a detached ice flow. Yes, preparation, always preparation. He sat down again, the chair accepting his weight with a familiar groan. He picked up the tin tray of pencils. He selected a graphite stick, a 4B, soft and dark. He took the penknife. He began to whittle away the wood. The cedar shavings curled away from the blade, spiraling down onto the desk. They were fragrant, a scent of dry forests and sunlight that seemed impossibly alien in this room. He watched the shavings fall. They were beautiful in their own way. Spirals of wood, thin as paper, fragile as the frost. He sharpened the pencil until the lead was a long, tapered needle. He tested the point on a scrap of paper. It made a smooth, dark line, perfect. He placed it back in the tray. He picked up another. A harder lead this time, an HB. Good for fine details, for the sharp edges of the crystals. He began to cut. The rhythm returned. Slice, turn, slice, turn. The knife against the wood, the wind against the wall, the breath in the throat. He looked at the window again. The frost had thickened in the last hour. The clear patch in the center was gone, overgrown by new crystals. The view was completely sealed. He was entombed in the cabin, wrapped in wood and snow. There was no outside world anymore. There was only this room, this light, this paper. The thought should have been terrifying, but it was not. It was simplifying. It narrowed the scope of his existence to the reach of his arm. He blew the cedar shavings off the desk. They fluttered to the floor, joining the dust and the lint in the shadows. He picked up the white pastel again. He was ready to continue. He would draw the secondary branching now, the smaller veins that radiated from the main arms of the fern. He leaned forward, his face inches from the paper, his breath warming the surface. He could see the grain of the paper, the hills and valleys of the pulp. He placed the pastel tip against the dark gray. He began to push. The white trail appeared, a road map of the cold. The silence of the room was a physical weight. It pressed against his eardrums, a thick, cottony pressure. Sometimes he imagined he could hear the ice shifting miles away, the deep, resonant booming of the pack fracturing under the stress of the tide. But tonight there was only the wind. The eternal, soft, relentless wind. It smoothed the snow outside, erasing footprints, burying the sledges, sculpting the drifts into aerodynamic shapes. It was the great eraser. And he was the recorder, scratching his lines before they were wiped away. He worked on a single crystal for what felt like an hour. He defined its facets, its sharp angles, the way it caught the imaginary light. He used the charcoal to deepen the shadow behind it, making it stand out in relief. It was slow work, microscopic work. It required a trance-like state of concentration. He forgot his cold feet. He forgot the stiffness in his back. He forgot the name of the ship that had brought him here. There was only the crystal. The crystal was the universe. He paused to wipe a smudge of charcoal from his finger. He used a rag that hung from the side of the desk. The rag was stained with 1,000 previous wipes, a tie-dye of black and gray and white. It was a history of his work, a textile record of every drawing he had made in the last 3 months. He looked at the stains. He could see the ghost of a saxifrage leaf in one smudge, the shadow of a poppy stem in another. They were memories of summer, fading into the grime. He looked back at the lantern. The oil level had dropped perceptibly. He would need to refill it soon, but not yet. There was still enough fuel for another hour of silence. He watched the flame flicker. It was the only moving thing in the room, the only thing that consumed and changed. Everything else was static, preserved, frozen. He felt a kinship with the flame. He, too, was consuming fuel, the hardtack and the salted beef, to keep his internal fire burning. He, too, was fighting the encroaching dark. He picked up the white pastel. He looked at the frost fern on the paper. It was growing. It was almost half finished. He could see the pattern emerging, the complex fractal beauty of the water freezing. It was a language he was slowly learning to read. The language of thermodynamics, the language of zero. He took a breath, held it, and brought the pastel down to the paper once more. The scratch of the chalk resumed, a tiny sound in the vast, muffled quiet of the polar night. The silence was not empty. It was a heavy, fluid substance that filled the cabin, displacing the air, pressing against the eardrums with a pressure that mimicked the depths of the ocean. It was a silence composed of layers, sedimented over the long months of the winter. There was the base layer of the frozen earth, a profound, resonant stillness that came from rock and permafrost. Above that lay the silence of the ice pack, a tension-filled quiet, like a held breath waiting for the release of a fracture. And closest to him, filling the small wooden box of the room, was the silence of suspended time. The botanist felt it settling on his shoulders, a physical weight, like a heavy woolen cloak soaked in freezing water. He sat motionless at the desk, his hand hovering over the dark gray paper, the white pastel stick held loosely in his fingers. The drawing of the frost fern lay beneath his hand, a spectral image of white lines and smudged shadows, glowing faintly in the circle of lantern light. He did not move to draw. He was waiting. He was listening to the house settle. The temperature outside was dropping, the mercury in the exterior thermometer contracting, retreating into its bulb. The wood of the cabin reacted to this thermal shift. The heavy beams of the ceiling contracted, emitting a sharp, dry crack that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room. The sound reverberated for a second, bouncing off the hard surfaces of the stove and the glass jars, before being swallowed by the wool blankets and the peat smoke. The botanist did not flinch. He knew these sounds. They were the language of the structure, the complaints of organic material forced to exist in an inorganic world. He waited for the echo to die, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of light above the lantern. They moved in slow, Brownian motion, unaffected by the cold, driven by the subtle currents of heat rising from the flame. He lowered the pastel to the paper. He was working on the periphery of the frost fern now, where the ice crystals dissolved into a fine, granular mist. This required a different technique. He laid the pastel stick flat on its side, pressing gently, dragging it across the texture of the paper. The result was a broad, broken stroke of white, a texture that perfectly mimicked the rough, unfinished edges of the frost. It was not a line, it was a suggestion of a surface. He repeated the motion, overlapping the strokes, building up a layer of white density that faded into the darkness of the paper. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was rhythmic, soothing, a dry friction that emphasized the aridity of the air. His eyes followed the movement of his hand, but his mind drifted to the water. The air in the cabin was incredibly dry. The stove, in its effort to heat the space, sucked every molecule of moisture from the atmosphere. His throat felt like parchment. His lips were chapped, the skin rough and peeling. He needed to hydrate. The thought was slow, rising through the molasses of his fatigue. Water. He placed the pastel in the tin tray where it settled with a soft metallic clink. He pushed the chair back. The legs dragged across the floorboards, a low, vibrating growl that traveled up his spine. He stood up, his joints stiff, locking into place with audible clicks. He was a mechanism of bone and sinew operating at the limits of its design tolerances. He walked to the corner of the room where the water barrel stood. It was a heavy wooden cask, banded with iron, sitting on a sturdy stand. But the water inside was not liquid. It was a solid block of ice, chopped from a freshwater iceberg trapped in the bay. To get a drink, he had to melt the world. He picked up a heavy iron chisel that hung from a nail on the wall. The metal was cold, biting into his palm even through the glove. He leaned over the barrel, the lantern light casting his shadow against the far wall, a looming, distorted giant that mimicked his movements. He looked down at the ice. It was black in the dim light, a deep obsidian mirror that reflected the faint orange glow of the stove. He positioned the chisel. He struck. The sound was sharp, brittle, chink. A shard of ice flew off, skittering across the floorboards like a diamond mouse. He struck again, chink, and again, chink. He was mining for water. He chipped away a bowlful of shards, collecting them in a battered tin saucepan. He carried the saucepan to the stove. The heat radiating from the cast iron was palpable, a solid wall of warmth that stopped abruptly 2 feet from the metal. He stepped into that zone, feeling the heat penetrate the layers of his clothing, the coat, the sweater, the shirt, the undershirt. It was a dull, aching warmth, thawing the surface but failing to reach the core. He placed the saucepan on the hot plate. The contact was instant. Hiss. The frost on the bottom of the pan turned to steam, vanishing in a whisper. He stood there, watching the ice. This was his television. This was his cinema. The melting of ice. He watched as the sharp edges of the shards began to soften, losing their definition. The white, opaque frost on the surface of the chips turned clear, revealing the dark metal of the pan beneath. A pool of liquid began to form at the bottom, dark and viscous-looking in the low light. The ice floated in its own meltwater, shifting and settling with tiny, tinkling sounds. Tink, clink. It was the sound of a miniature glacier breaking apart. He watched the phase change, the miraculous conversion of solid to liquid. It was a process that required energy he had harvested from the earth in the form of peat. He was trading ancient moss for present water. The steam began to rise from the pan, a thin, curling ribbon of white vapor. It rose straight up, caught in the thermal updraft of the stove, twisting and turning like a spectral dancer. It smelled of nothing. It was pure, distilled water, ancient snow that had fallen centuries before he was born, now released into the air of this wooden box. He leaned forward, inhaling the steam. It was moist and warm, a balm to his dry nasal passages. He closed his eyes, letting the vapor condense on his face, tiny droplets of water forming on his eyelashes, on the stubble of his cheek. For a moment, he was in a rainforest. For a moment, he was in a bathhouse. Then he opened his eyes, and the gray wood of the cabin walls reasserted itself. He waited until the last sliver of ice had vanished, dissolving into the dark water. He did not let it boil. Boiling was a waste of fuel. He lifted the pan, wrapping the handle in the hem of his coat to protect his hand. He poured the water into a ceramic mug. The sound of the pouring was different now, a fluid, gurgling sound, rich and heavy. He held the mug in both hands, letting the heat seep into his palms, warming the blood that flowed through his cold fingers. He took a sip. The water was hot, tasting faintly of iron and smoke. It scalded his tongue pleasantly, sending a shock of warmth down his throat, into his stomach. He felt the heat radiating outward from his core, a momentary victory against the entropy of the Arctic. He walked back to the desk, carrying the mug like a holy chalice. He set it down on a coaster made of cork, careful not to spill a drop on his papers. The steam from the mug rose into the light, joining the smoke from the lantern. He sat down. The chair groaned again. He picked up the drawing. He looked at it with fresh eyes, or as fresh as eyes could be after 4 months of darkness. The frost fern was static, captured in graphite and pastel. But the real frost on the window was dynamic. He looked at the pane. The pattern had changed in the 20 minutes he had been away from the desk. The fern he was drawing had been overtaken by a new formation, a series of concentric ridges that looked like the cross-section of an agate geode. The ice was rewriting itself, layer upon layer. He felt a pang of futility. He could never capture it all. The speed of the crystal growth outpaced his hand. He was documenting a vanishing world. But that was the duty, to try, to record the fleeting architecture of the cold. He picked up a charcoal pencil. It was time to add the deepest shadows. To make the white pop, the black had to be absolute. He looked at the spaces between the fronds of the ice fern. In the drawing, they were gray. In reality, on the window, they were black, the black of the polar night pressing against the glass. He needed to push the value darker. He sharpened the charcoal pencil with the knife, the black dust falling like soot onto the desk. He blew it away gently. He applied the charcoal to the paper. He pressed hard, crushing the burnt wood into the fibers of the paper. The black mark was velvet deep, light-absorbing. He worked into the negative spaces, carving out the shape of the ice by defining what it was not. It was a subtractive process in his mind, even though he was adding material. He was defining the void. Scritch, scratch. The charcoal sounded different than the pastel. It was grittier, earthier. It dragged on the paper with a lower frequency. He worked his way around the perimeter of the main crystal, darkening the background. The effect was immediate. The white pastel seemed to glow, to detach itself from the surface. The ice flower began to float in a sea of darkness. It looked fragile, lonely, beautiful. He paused to admire the contrast. This was the essence of the North, the absolute binary of light and dark. There were no mid-tones in the winter, only the stark illumination of the moon or the lantern, and the consuming shadow of everything else. The wind outside shifted again, dropping to a low murmur. It was playing the cabin like a cello, bowing the walls to produce a continuous, droning note. The botanist felt the vibration in the soles of his feet. He was inside the instrument. He was part of the resonance. He took another sip of hot water. It had cooled slightly, but it was still warm enough to comfort. He looked at the row of glass jars on the back of the desk. They held his botanical specimens from the summer, tiny, withered plants suspended in alcohol. A purple saxifrage, a tuft of Arctic cotton, a sliver of lichen. They looked pale and ghostly in the yellow light, drowned in their preservatives. They were the dead. The frost on the window was the living. He wondered about the temperature of the glass. He reached out and touched the side of one of the jars. It was freezing. The alcohol remained liquid, but it was cold enough to burn the skin. He withdrew his hand quickly. The cold was a presence in the room, a silent animal that moved into any space left unguarded. It sat in the corners. It huddled under the bunk. It waited in the glass jars. He pulled his sleeves down over his wrists, tucking his chin into the collar of his coat. He returned to the drawing. He wanted to capture the texture of the ribs of the ice fern, the way the crystal structure built up in ridges. He used a blending stump, a rolled cylinder of paper, to smudge the charcoal shadow he had just laid down. He pushed the black dust into the gray paper, softening the edge, creating a gradient that suggested depth and curvature. The friction of the paper stump heated the surface slightly. He worked methodically, moving from one frond to the next, blurring the line between the object and the void. He lost track of time. There was no clock in his line of sight. He had a pocket watch, a heavy silver timepiece, but it was tucked deep in his waistcoat pocket, stopped by the cold or by his own neglect. It didn't matter. The sun would not rise for another 2 months. The schedule was internal: sleep when tired, eat when hungry, draw when awake, stoke the fire when cold. It was a biological rhythm, unmoored from the mechanical division of the day. He found himself staring at a single point on the paper, a junction where 3 lines of white pastel intersected. He was mesmerized by the geometry, triangles, hexagons, the math of water. He felt a drowsiness stealing over him, a heavy, warm fog that blurred his vision. The lantern flame seemed to expand, filling his field of view with a soft, pulsing orange light. The scratching of the pencil became a distant sound belonging to someone else. He blinked, forcing his eyes to focus. He could not sleep yet. The drawing was not finished. The fire needed tending. The duty remained. He shook his head, a small, sharp movement to rattle the brain awake. He took a deep breath of the cool, still air. It smelled of old paper and kerosene. He picked up the white pastel again. He needed to highlight the tips of the fern, the sharpest points where the crystal growth was most active. He sharpened the pastel again, shaving it to a needle point. He held his breath to steady his hand. He touched the paper, dot, dot, flick. He created a tiny spur of white, a thorn of ice, dot, dot, flick. Another one. He was building a forest of thorns. He worked with the precision of a jeweler, faceting the ice with white dust. He was aware of the immense weight of the roof above him, the tons of snow that had accumulated over the winter. The cabin was a bubble, a cavity in the snowpack. If the beams failed, the white would rush in, filling the space, burying the desk, the jars, the lantern, the man. He would become just another specimen, frozen in the strata of the Arctic. The thought was not frightening. It was merely a geological possibility. He accepted it as he accepted the wind. He looked at the lantern. The wick was carbonizing, a small mushroom of black soot forming on the tip. It dulled the flame, making the light more orange, more somber. He needed to trim it. He reached for the small pair of brass scissors he kept in the desk drawer. He opened the drawer. It slid out with a wooden shriek. Inside, neatly arranged, were his supplies, extra leads, erasers, a magnifying glass, a compass, and a small, leather-bound book, his journal. He ignored the journal. He had nothing to write. Wind, cold, dark. The entries were all the same. He took the scissors. He stood up and reached for the lantern. He turned the knob to lower the wick, reducing the flame to a blue sliver. He opened the glass door of the lantern. The heat escaped, brushing his face. He carefully snipped the top of the wick. The black soot fell onto the burner. He closed the door and turned the knob up. The flame flared bright and clear, a renewed yellow light that pushed the shadows back a few inches. The room felt suddenly larger, cleaner. He sat back down. The change in light revealed details in the drawing he had missed. A smudge here, a weak line there. He picked up the eraser, a gum cube that was hard from the cold. He rubbed at a mistake. The eraser crumbled, leaving rubber crumbs on the paper. He swept them away with the drafting brush, a soft burst of horsehair that whispered across the page. Swish, swish. The wind gusted again, harder this time. A fine spray of snow hissed against the outside of the window pane. He could hear it, a sound like sand being thrown against the glass. The storm was intensifying. The world outside was becoming more hostile, more chaotic. But inside, on the square of gray paper, there was order. There was structure. He was imposing logic onto the chaos. He was making the ice understandable. He looked at his hands. They were stained with the materials of his trade. White dust on the fingertips, black charcoal in the cuticles, gray smudges on the palms. He was becoming a grayscale man. He felt a strange affection for the dirt. It was evidence of industry. It proved he existed. He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, feeling the grit of the pastel. It was a tactile sensation in a world that often felt numb. He leaned in close to the paper again. He wanted to work on the base of the frost fern, where it emerged from the edge of the window frame. In reality, it grew out of the wood, fed by the moisture trapped in the sash. He needed to draw the transition from darkness to ice. He picked up a gray pastel, a shade slightly lighter than the paper. He used it to create a mid-tone, a bridge between the deep charcoal background and the bright white ice. He sketched the vague, blurry shape of the window frame, keeping it out of focus. The ice was the subject. The wood was just the setting. He worked slowly, layering the gray over the charcoal, blending them together to create a soft, murky boundary. It looked like fog. It looked like the breath of the house. He was painting the atmosphere now, the invisible air that held the cold. He paused to assess the balance of the composition. It was heavy on the right where the main fern clustered. He needed to balance it on the left. He looked at the window. There was a smaller, isolated crystal growing in the corner, a perfect six-pointed star. He would add that, a satellite to the main planet. He marked the position of the star with the white pastel, a single dot, the center of the new universe. He began to radiate lines outward from that dot, creating the hexagonal symmetry. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the skeleton of the snowflake. He fleshed them out, adding the dendritic branches. It was a repetitive, meditative task. It was like knitting with dust. The cold was seeping through his boots now. He wiggled his toes, feeling the wool of his socks rub against the leather. The sensation was dull, distant. His feet felt like wooden blocks attached to his ankles. He stamped them gently on the floor, thud, thud. The sound was deadened by the timber. He considered putting more peat on the fire but decided to wait. He had a rhythm. He didn't want to break it. He would finish the star first. He continued to draw, his hand moving in the small circle of light. The rest of the room fell away. The bunk, the trunk, the shelves, they ceased to exist. There was only the point of the pastel and the surface of the paper. The scratching sound was the only sound in the world. Scritch, scritch. The white lines grew, extending, branching, freezing onto the page. He was a conduit for the cold. He was sketching the temperature. He was drawing the silence. The star took shape. It was sharp, crystalline, aggressive in its perfection. It contrasted with the softer, more organic flow of the large fern. It was a jewel. He added a touch of charcoal to the center, giving it a hollow eye. He stepped back, metaphorically, as he only leaned back in his chair to view the whole. The composition was better, balanced. The tension between the large mass and the small spark created a visual dialogue. He exhaled a long breath. The vapor cloud was thick, swirling in the lantern light. He watched it dissipate. He felt a deep, heavy satisfaction. Not joy, joy was too energetic a word for this place, but a sense of correctness, a sense of alignment. He was doing what he was meant to do. He was the witness. He was the scribe of the ice. He placed the pastel down. He needed to stretch. He placed his hands on the edge of the desk and pushed himself up. The chair slid back. He stood in the center of the room, swaying slightly. The circulation returning to his legs caused a prickling sensation, like needles of ice melting in his veins. He looked at the stove. The red glow of the coals was dimming. It was time. He picked up the iron hook. He walked to the stove. He opened the door. The heat washed over him, fading but still alive. He reached for the peat. The block was heavy, rough, prehistoric. He placed it in the fire. He watched the smoke rise. He closed the door. He turned back to the room. The lantern light reflected in the black glass of the window, creating a mirror. He saw himself, a dark, bulky shape, a face half hidden in shadow and beard, eyes that looked tired, sunken, but calm. He looked at his reflection for a long moment, acknowledging the stranger in the glass. Then he looked past his reflection at the frost on the other side. The white garden. It was still growing. It was always growing. He walked back to the desk. He sat down. He picked up the white pastel. There was more to do. The night was long. The paper was waiting. He brought the chalk to the surface. Scritch. The sound resumed. The silence held. The story of the ice continued, one line at a time. The circle of glass was heavy, rimmed in brass that had dulled to the color of old chestnuts. The botanist held the magnifying glass in his left hand, the metal cooling his palm through the wool of the fingerless glove. He brought the lens down toward the paper, his movements hydraulic in their slowness, controlled by a friction of muscle and cold air. As the lens descended, the world within the brass ring warped and magnified. The gray texture of the paper, previously a flat field of color, erupted into a rugged landscape of peaks and valleys. The fibers of the pulp, pressed and dried in a factory thousands of miles south, rose up like tangled forests of petrified wood. The surface was not smooth. It was a chaotic terrain of cellulose, a microscopic topography waiting to be mapped. He focused on the line of white pastel he had just drawn. Through the glass, the mark was no longer a solid stroke. It was a scattering of boulders, huge irregular chunks of white pigment that clung to the paper fibers like snow clinging to the branches of a fallen tree. He could see the gaps between the particles, the dark gray abysses of the paper showing through the white scree. It was a revelation of structure. The illusion of the continuous line was broken, replaced by the reality of the granular. He studied the distribution of the dust. It was random, yet governed by the physics of friction and adhesion. The pastel had caught on the high points of the paper grain, skipping over the low points, creating a natural texture that mimicked the roughness of the ice itself. He moved the lens slowly to the right, tracking the trajectory of the drawn frost fern. The image swam slightly at the edges of the glass, a chromatic aberration that fringed the white lines with ghostly halos of blue and orange. He ignored the distortion, focusing on the center of the field. He was looking for density. He needed the core of the ice crystal to feel solid, impenetrable. He saw a patch where the paper showed through too clearly, a weakness in the ice. He lowered the lens, placing it gently on the desk. The brass clinked against the wood, a dull, heavy sound that seemed to drop straight to the floor. He picked up the white pastel again. He did not sharpen it this time. He needed a blunt instrument to pack the pigment into the valleys of the paper. He pressed the tip down into the area he had identified. He applied pressure, feeling the pastel stick flex slightly under his thumb. He rubbed it in a small, circular motion. Grind, grind, grind. The sound was lower, more muffled than the scratching of the point. It was the sound of material being forced into place. He lifted the pastel and blew away the excess loose dust. He picked up the lens again to verify the work. The gap was gone. The white was solid, a dense pack of pigment that blocked out the gray. It looked like hard ice, the kind that formed deep in the fissures of the glaciers, compressed by centuries of weight. He sat back, the chair groaning its familiar wooden complaint. He rubbed his eyes. The strain of the magnification lingered, a phantom zoom that made the room look distant and small for a moment. He blinked, resetting his focal length to the scale of the cabin. The shadows in the corners seemed to have thickened, heavy drapes of indigo and charcoal that absorbed the lantern light. The silence was absolute, save for the wind. The wind had changed its timbre. It was no longer a low moan. It had pitched up to a steady, high-frequency whistle, a sound produced by the air being forced through the sharp ridges of the pack ice outside. It was a thin, piercing sound, like a bow being drawn across a single, tight string of a violin made of ice. He listened to the whistle. It was a directional sound. He turned his head slowly, scanning the room with his ears. The sound seemed to be localized near the door. He stood up, his heavy boots anchoring him to the floor. He walked toward the door, moving through the layers of temperature. Near the stove, the air was tepid. 3 steps away, it was cool. By the door, it was freezing. He could feel the cold radiating from the heavy timber planks, a wall of negative thermal energy. He crouched down, his knees popping, to inspect the threshold. There at the bottom corner of the door, where the wood had warped slightly from the dampness of the autumn, was a gap. It was hairline, barely visible, but to the wind it was a canyon. He placed his ungloved hand near the crack. He felt it, a needle-sharp stream of air, colder than the air in the room, cutting across his skin like a razor. It was a breach. The outside was leaking in. He stared at the crack, analyzing the physics of the draft. The high pressure of the storm was forcing the atmosphere into the low pressure of the cabin. It was an equalization process that, if left unchecked, would slowly drain the heat from his shelter. He stood up and walked to the trunk at the foot of his bunk. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside were layers of wool, canvas, and felt. He rummaged through the contents until he found a strip of old rag, a piece of coarse burlap that had once wrapped a side of bacon. It was stiff and smelled of salt and smoke. He took the rag and a small wooden mallet from his tool kit. He returned to the door. He knelt again. He twisted the burlap into a tight rope, compressing the fibers until they were dense and hard. He placed the tip of the burlap rope against the crack. He took the mallet. Tap, tap, tap. He drove the fabric into the fissure. The sound was dull, a percussive thudding that resonated in the solid wood of the doorframe. He worked methodically, inch by inch, forcing the insulation into the gap. He was sealing the hull. He was caulking the seams of his wooden submarine. Tap, tap, tap. With each blow, the whistle of the wind was stifled, cut off until it was reduced to a faint, muffled murmur. The needle of cold air vanished. The breach was closed. He remained kneeling for a moment, inspecting his handiwork. The burlap was wedged tight, a brown scar in the gray wood. It was ugly, but it was functional. In the aesthetics of survival, function was the only beauty. He stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. The exertion had warmed him slightly, a faint flush of heat rising in his chest. He walked back to the stove to capitalize on this warmth. He held his hands out over the hot plate, fingers splayed. The iron was black and sullen, radiating a steady infrared hum. He looked at the kettle. A thin wisp of steam was still escaping from the spout, a testament to the water's lingering heat. He did not drink. He just absorbed. He watched the firelight play through the grate at the front of the stove. The coals were shifting, settling into a bed of glowing ash. Occasionally, a spark would fly up the chimney, a tiny, ascending star destined to die in the soot-lined dark. He returned to the desk. The drawing waited. It lay there, a flat object on a wooden surface, yet it contained a depth that drew him in. He sat down. He looked at the tray of pastels. He needed a shadow color. Pure black was too harsh for the internal shadows of the ice. Black was for the void, for the night. The shadows within the ice itself were blue. They were the color of the deep ocean, the color of twilight, the color of oxygen trapped in water. He scanned the rows of chalk. There were grays, whites, blacks, and there in the corner a stick of Prussian blue. It was a dark, intense color, almost black in the dim light. He picked it up. It felt different from the white pastel. It was denser, heavily pigmented. He tested it on a scrap of paper. The mark it made was a deep, rich indigo, a color that seemed to recede into the paper. It was perfect. He sharpened it with the knife, shaving away the coating to reveal the core of compressed blue dust. The shavings fell onto the desk, dark azure flakes that looked like petals of a poisonous flower. He brushed them into the brass bowl, mixing them with the white dust. A pale blue mixture began to form in the bowl, the color of a winter sky at dawn. He turned to the drawing. He wanted to shade the underside of the frost fern's main stem. He applied the blue pastel lightly, barely touching the paper. He wanted a whisper of color, not a shout. He laid down a thin veil of blue over the gray paper, right next to the hard white edge of the ice. He then took the blending stump, the paper cylinder stained with charcoal. He cleaned the tip on the rag, rubbing it vigorously until the black was gone. He then used the clean tip to push the blue pigment into the paper. The effect was subtle but transformative. The white line of the ice suddenly lifted off the page. The blue shadow gave it volume mass. It looked cold. If he touched the paper there, he imagined his finger would freeze to it. He continued to work the blue into the crevices of the drawing, defining the overlapping layers of the crystals. The ice was no longer a flat pattern. It was a structure with foreground and background. It had architecture. He worked in silence, the rhythm of his breathing synchronizing with the movement of his hand. In stroke, out lift, in blend, out assess. The wind outside was a constant low-frequency pressure, a reminder of the scale of the world beyond the walls, but in here the scale was microscopic. He was lost in the geography of the paper grain. He was exploring a continent that existed only in his mind and on this sheet of gray pulp. He paused to look at the lantern again. The flame was steady, a teardrop of fire suspended on a blackened wick. The oil in the reservoir was visible through the clear glass base, a yellow liquid that sloshed gently when the wind shook the cabin. It was the lifeblood of the room. Without it, the darkness would be absolute. He respected the oil. He conserved it. He kept the flame low, just bright enough to see the tip of the pencil. The shadows in the room were deep, encroaching on his peripheral vision. He felt them gathering behind him, silent spectators leaning in to watch him work. He did not turn around. He knew what was there. The bunk, the trunk, the hanging clothes that looked like headless men in the gloom. They were harmless. They were just objects waiting for the light. He decided to introduce a secondary light source in the drawing. A reflection. Ice was a mirror. It reflected the world around it. In this case, the ice on the window was reflecting the lantern. He needed to add a warm highlight to the cold blue and white. He looked for a pastel that matched the flame. He found a piece of yellow ochre, a dull, earthy gold. He picked it up. It was a warm color, a piece of solidified sunlight. It felt out of place in the palette of cold tones. He hesitated. To add yellow was a risk. It could ruin the purity of the cold, but realism demanded it. The ice saw the fire. He chose a single facet of the crystal, a flat plane that would catch the angle of the light. He touched the ochre to the paper. Dot. A tiny speck of gold appeared in the sea of blue and white. He softened it with his finger, blurring the edges until it became a faint, glowing glint. It worked. It brought the drawing to life. It connected the ice to the room. The frost was no longer an abstract form. It was this frost on this window, lit by this lantern. He added a few more glints, careful not to overdo it, just a few sparks of warmth trapped in the freezing glass. He sat back to admire the effect. The drawing shimmered in the low light. It was becoming a portal. He felt a strange urge to reach into it, to touch the drawn ice, to feel if it was cold. He resisted. It was just dust on paper. It was an illusion. His stomach gave a low rumble, a sound of internal shifting. He ignored it. Hunger was a dull ache that came and went, a tidal rhythm that he had learned to suppress. He was not starving, he was simply empty. There was a difference. He would eat later when the drawing was at a stopping point. For now, the hunger was just another sensation, like the cold toes or the stiff neck. It was a signal to be noted and filed away. He picked up a graphite pencil, the 4B he had sharpened earlier. He wanted to refine the edges of the agate formation, the concentric ridges of ice that looked like ripples in a pond. The graphite was sharp and precise. It cut through the soft pastel, defining boundaries. He drew a thin, hard line along the edge of a white curve. The metallic sheen of the graphite caught the lantern light, creating a distinct contrast with the matte texture of the chalk. It was an interplay of materials, carbon and calcium, grease and dust. He found himself thinking about the geological history of the graphite. Ancient forests, buried and compressed, turned to stone, then mined and encased in cedar, and the pastel ground pigment bound with gum, and the paper cotton rags pulped and pressed. He was manipulating the detritus of the world, rearranging matter to create meaning. It was a solemn responsibility. He drew a line, scritch. He drew another, scritch. The sound was the heartbeat of the room. He looked at the window again. The frost had thickened further. The view was now completely obscured. The glass was a wall of white masonry. The fern he was drawing was now buried under a new layer of moss, a fuzzy, indistinct growth of crystals that softened the sharp lines of the earlier formation. The subject was disappearing. He was drawing a ghost. He felt a pang of loss. The beautiful, sharp geometry he had fallen in love with was gone, consumed by the relentless accumulation of ice. But the drawing preserved it. The drawing was a memory. He returned to the paper with renewed purpose. He had to finish the fern before his memory of it faded. He worked faster, his hand moving with a fluid urgency. He deepened the blue shadows. He sharpened the white tips. He blended the gray mist. He was racing against the erosion of his own recall. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in, focusing all existence onto the square of paper. He noticed a small imperfection in the paper, a tiny knot of fiber that stood up from the surface. He tried to draw over it, but the pencil skipped, leaving a white gap. He used the knife to gently scrape the knot away. Scrape, scrape. The fiber came loose, floating away like a microscopic feather. He smoothed the area with his fingernail, burnishing the paper until it was flat. He drew the line again. This time it was perfect. Smooth, unbroken, cold. He felt a draft again, fainter this time. It was not coming from the door. It was coming from the floorboards beneath the desk. The cold air was rising from the crawlspace, seeping through the gaps between the planks. It wrapped around his ankles, a cold vapor that ignored his wool socks. He shifted his feet, crossing them to minimize the surface area exposed to the draft. There was nothing to be done about the floor. It was a sieve. He had to accept the cold rising from below. It was the breath of the permafrost. He reached for the mug of water. It was lukewarm now, bordering on cold. He drank it anyway. The liquid was hydrating even if it provided no warmth. He felt it slide down his throat, a neutral fluid entering his system. He set the mug down. A drop of water ran down the side of the ceramic and pooled on the coaster. He watched it. It was a lens, just like the magnifying glass. It reflected the lantern, a tiny, distorted star in a liquid sky. He touched the drop with his finger. It broke, spreading into a thin, wet film. It would evaporate soon, joining the humidity of the room, eventually to freeze on the window. Every drop of water ended up on the glass. He picked up the white pastel again. He wanted to add the spines to the fern, the tiny, hair-like crystals that grew perpendicular to the main stem. This required a delicate touch. He held the pastel by the very end, letting the weight of the stick do the work. He tapped the paper rhythmically. Tap, 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 tap. A row of white dots appeared. He then flicked the pastel upward from each dot, creating a tiny spike. Flick, flick, flick. The fern grew thorns. It became defensive. It looked sharp, dangerous, beautiful. He worked his way up the stem, adding spines to every inch. It was tedious work, but he found comfort in the repetition. It was a mantra. Tap, flick, tap, flick. The mind emptied. There was no past, no future. Only the current spine. Only the white dust on the gray field. He was a machine, a biological plotter printing the design of nature. The wind outside gusted, a long, mournful howl that circled the cabin. The flame of the lantern shivered. The shadows on the wall danced a slow, disjointed waltz. The botanist paused, his hands suspended in the air. He waited for the wind to settle. He waited for the light to stabilize. He was patient. The ice was patient. He lowered his hand, tap, flick. The work continued. He looked at the brass bowl where he had mixed the blue and white dust. There was still a small pile left. He dipped his finger into it, coating the pad of his index finger in the pale blue powder. He brought his finger to the paper and rubbed it gently into the background, far away from the fern. He was creating the atmosphere of the drawing, the ambient cold that surrounded the object. He swirled his finger in soft, cloud-like motions. The blue dust spread, thinning out into a faint, icy haze. It looked like the air inside an iceberg. It looked like the breath of a sleeping giant. He wiped his finger on the rag. The rag was now a complex tapestry of charcoal, white, blue, and ochre. It was a work of art in itself, an accidental abstract expression of the night's labor. He looked at it for a moment, appreciating the chaotic beauty of the stains. Then he turned back to the ordered beauty of the drawing. The contrast was pleasing. Chaos and order, entropy and structure. The war of the universe fought on a desk in the Arctic. He felt a sudden sharp cramp in his right hand. The cold and the repetitive gripping had taken their toll. The muscles of his thumb seized, locking the digit against his palm. He dropped the pastel. It rolled across the desk, coming to rest against the base of the lantern. He grimaced, massaging his hand with his left. He kneaded the palm, forcing the blood back into the contracted tissue. He flexed the fingers. Open, close, open, close. The joints clicked. The pain was sharp, then dull, then fading. It was a reminder. He was biological. He was fragile. He needed to pace himself. He rested his hand on the warm wood of the desk near the circle of light. He let it sit there, recovering. He looked at the pastel that had rolled away. It lay in the shadow of the lamp, a small cylinder of potential. He would pick it up in a moment. For now, he just breathed. In, out, in, out. The steam rose, the wind blew, the ice waited. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the layers of snow outside were compressing the walls. The ceiling felt lower. The air felt denser. He was the nucleus of a cell, surrounded by a thick frozen membrane. He was safe, yet trapped, protected, yet imprisoned. The duality was constant. He looked at the drawing. The ice fern was almost done. It floated on the paper, a perfect, frozen specimen that would never melt. He had saved it. He had captured the fleeting geometry of the water. He reached out and retrieved the pastel. He held it in his recovering hand. The grip was looser now, more careful. He brought it back to the paper. There were a few more spines to add, a few more shadows to deepen. The night was still young. The silence was still deep. He resumed his work, the scratching of the chalk the only testament to his wakefulness in the sleeping world. The botanist sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the minuscule topography of the paper. The silence in the cabin had acquired a granular quality, as if the air itself were crystallizing, thickening with the drop in temperature. He could feel the cold pressing against the back of his neck, a phantom hand composed of drafts and radiant loss. It was a physical presence, a silent roommate that occupied the space behind him, waiting for the fire to fail. He ignored it. He was accustomed to the proximity of the freeze. It was the baseline of his existence, the 0 point from which all comfort was measured. He focused instead on the tip of the white pastel, which was currently resting on the edge of a paper grain, poised to create a highlight. He was working on the intricate lattice where two fronds of the frost fern overlapped. This was a complex intersection of transparency and opacity. The lower frond was visible through the upper one, but its lines were distorted, refracted by the prism of the overlying ice. To render this, he had to lighten his touch to the point of near non-existence. He needed to deposit a veil of pigment so thin that the charcoal lines beneath remained visible, yet altered. He held the pastel with the tips of his thumb and forefinger, floating it above the surface. He lowered it. The contact was barely felt. Hush. The sound was softer than a scratch. It was a whisper of dust. He moved the pastel in a tiny arc, glazing the paper with a milky translucency. He pulled back to observe. The effect was successful. The lower frond looked submerged, trapped beneath a sheet of glass. It had depth. It had the visual logic of ice. He felt a quiet thrill of competence. In a world where survival was a clumsy, brutal affair of chopping ice and hauling fuel, this delicate manipulation of light and shadow was a reminder of civilized grace. It was a tether to the world of libraries and laboratories, places where the temperature was constant and the air smelled of floor wax, not soot. He reached for the rag to wipe his fingers. The cloth was stiff with accumulated charcoal and graphite, a hardened palette of his labors. He found a relatively clean spot, a patch of gray canvas, and rubbed his fingertips against it. The friction generated a localized heat that was quickly dissipated by the surrounding air. He looked at his hand. The skin was parched, the lines of his knuckles deepened by dehydration and cold. He was weathering, just like the wood of the cabin. He was becoming textured. He turned his attention to the lantern. The flame had remained steady, but the glass chimney was beginning to cloud with a faint film of soot near the top. This reduced the luminance in the upper hemisphere of the room, lowering the ceiling of light. He considered cleaning it, but the glass would be hot. It was a risk. A burn would be slow to heal in this climate. He decided to leave it. The dimming light added to the atmosphere. It drew the focus down to the desk, narrowing the world even further. He looked at the row of pencils in the tin tray. They lay in parallel alignment, soldiers in a wooden army. He selected a 2H graphite pencil, a hard, pale lead used for preliminary guidelines and subtle shading. He needed to define the outer boundary of the frost formation, where the ice faded into the clear glass, or what used to be clear glass before the secondary layer of frost had formed. He wanted to suggest the imperceptible transition from solid to void. He began to hatch. Tick, 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 tick. The sound of the hard lead on the paper was percussive, a rapid-fire clicking that measured out the seconds. He drew a series of fine parallel lines, spacing them closely together. He then crossed them with another set of lines at a 45-degree angle, cross-hatching. It was an engraver's technique, a way of building tone through line. He worked methodically, creating a mesh of gray that hovered on the edge of visibility. It looked like a mist, like a breath on a cold mirror. The wind outside shifted its weight, leaning against the southern wall of the cabin. The timber frame responded with a deep, resonant creak, a sound that seemed to come from the bones of the structure. The botanist felt the vibration travel through the floor and up the legs of the chair. It was a reminder that he was effectively living inside a wooden lung, expanding and contracting with the pressures of the storm. He did not look up. The creaking was part of the symphony. It was the bass line to the treble of the wind whistle. He paused to adjust his posture. He had been hunched over the drawing for too long. His spine felt fused, the vertebrae locked together by tension and cold. He straightened his back slowly, feeling the muscles protest. He rolled his shoulders, hearing the wet crunch of cartilage. He extended his neck, tilting his head back to look at the ceiling. The planks above were dark, stained with smoke. In the gaps between the boards, he could see the fibrous insulation of moss and oakum he had packed there months ago. It was holding. No snow was sifting through. The roof was tight. He lowered his head and looked at the stove. The red eye of the draft vent was glowing dully. The heat output was declining. It was time for another block of peat. He stood up, the movement heavy and deliberate. He walked to the scuttle. It was nearly empty. He would need to bring in more fuel from the Linta tomorrow. The thought was a heavy stone in his mind. Going outside was an expedition. It required armoring oneself against the hostile air, but that was a problem for tomorrow. For now, there was enough. He picked up a sod of peat. It was dense, brown, ancient matter. He opened the stove door. The embers greeted him with a wash of weak infrared radiation. He placed the sod gently onto the bed of coals. He watched it for a moment, waiting for the smoke to curl, confirming that the draft was drawing it up the chimney and not into the room. A wisp of gray smoke spiraled upward, disappearing into the flue. Satisfied, he closed the door. The latch clicked, a solid iron sound. He remained standing by the stove for a minute, soaking in the ambient heat. He turned slowly, warming his back, then his sides. He was roasting himself on a spit of his own making. He looked around the room from this vantage point. It was a tableau of containment. The bunk with its mound of blankets, the shelves with their silent books, the desk with its pool of light. It was a life reduced to the essentials. There was no clutter, no excess. Everything in the room had a function. Everything was necessary for survival or for the work. He walked back to the desk. He sat down. The chair was still warm from his body. It was a small comfort, a thermal memory of his presence. He picked up the drawing board, tilting it toward the light to check for glare. The graphite lines shone like silver threads. The pastel was matte and velvet. The contrast was pleasing. He set the board back down. He decided to work on the roots of the frost fern, the point where the crystal structure seemed to emerge from the darkness of the window frame. In his imagination, he saw the frost not as a deposit on the glass, but as a plant growing out of the wood, fed by the sap of the timber. He wanted to capture that organic connection. He chose a stick of raw umber pastel, a dark, cool brown. It was the color of frozen earth, of shadowed bark. He applied the umber to the bottom edge of the paper, grounding the composition. He made short, vertical strokes, mimicking the grain of the wood frame. He blended the brown into the gray of the background, creating a murky, indistinct transition. Then he took the white pastel and drew fine, root-like tendrils extending from the white fern down into the brown shadow. It looked as if the ice were anchoring itself, digging in to withstand the wind. It was a botanical lie, but an artistic truth. He stopped to sharpen the umber pastel. He used the knife, paring away the chalk in thin slices. The brown dust mixed with the blue and white in the brass bowl, creating a muddy, complex gray. He looked at the pile of dust. It was the color of the Arctic sky during a storm. It was the color of the sea ice when the light failed. He was manufacturing the palette of the north from the dust of the south. He picked up the magnifying glass again. He wanted to examine the texture of the paper in the root area. He brought the lens down. The brown pastel looked like soil. The white pastel looked like roots. The illusion held up even under magnification. He was satisfied. He placed the lens down. Clink. His eyes drifted to the thermometer hanging on the wall by the door. It was a brass instrument, long and slender. The red alcohol column was low, hovering just above the mark for 50 degrees inside. 50 degrees. It was cold for a living room, but warm for an ice station. Outside, it was likely 30 below zero. The differential was 80 degrees. That 80 degrees was sustained by the cast iron box and the ancient peat. It was a fragile equilibrium. He rubbed his hands together, the friction creating a dry, rasping sound. His skin was so dry it felt like paper. He reached for a small tin of tallow balm he kept on the desk. He unscrewed the lid. The balm was hard, white, frozen solid. He dug a small amount out with his thumbnail and rubbed it into his palms. The heat of his skin slowly melted the fat, turning it into a slick oil. He worked it into his knuckles, his cuticles. The smell was faint, animalistic. It was the smell of life. It was a barrier against the drying air. He wiped the excess balm on the rag. His hands felt slightly more flexible now, the skin less tight. He picked up the charcoal pencil. He wanted to deepen the contrast around the central spine of the fern. He needed the white to be blindingly bright, and to achieve that, the adjacent darks had to be abyssal. He pressed the charcoal hard into the paper right next to the white line. He held his breath to steady the stroke. Scritch, scratch. The sound was loud, aggressive. He was carving the darkness. He created a sharp, jagged edge of black that threw the white spine into high relief. It looked like a mountain peak catching the last light of the sun while the valley below fell into shadow. It was dramatic. It was operatic. He continued this high-contrast work along the length of the spine, alternating between the charcoal and the white pastel to refine the edge. He was sharpening the blade of the ice. The wind suddenly died down. The whistle stopped. The creaking stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was sudden and overwhelming. It was a vacuum silence. The botanist froze, his hands suspended. He listened. He could hear the hiss of the lamp. He could hear the tick of the cooling stove. He could hear the blood rushing in his own ears, a low, rhythmic swooshing sound. The absence of wind was almost more unsettling than the wind itself. It felt like the world was holding its breath. He waited, 10 seconds, 20. Then a low rumble began in the distance, a vibration that he felt in his chest before he heard it. It was the ice pack moving. Miles away, out in the bay, the tide was turning, shifting the millions of tons of ice. The rumble grew louder, a deep tectonic grinding that sounded like the earth clearing its throat. Then a sharp crack, like a cannon shot, echoed across the frozen plain. The ice had fractured. Then silence again. The botanist exhaled. The world was still turning. The physics were still in operation. He lowered his hand to the paper. The interruption had broken his flow, but only for a moment. He resumed the shading. The charcoal dust smeared slightly under his hand, creating a soft gray shadow where he rested his palm. He would have to erase that later, or maybe leave it. It was a record of the process. He looked at the glass jar nearest to him on the desk. It contained a specimen of Papaver radicatum, the Arctic poppy. The flower was pale yellow, its petals crinkled like crepe paper, suspended in the clear fluid. It looked impossibly fragile. How could such a delicate thing survive here? He knew the science. The hairy stems, the parabolic shape of the flower that focused the sun onto the pistils, the antifreeze proteins in the sap. But looking at it now, in the dead of winter, it seemed like a miracle, a ghost of summer trapped in glass. He felt a kinship with the poppy. He, too, was a fragile organism surviving through adaptation and insulation. He looked back at his drawing. The frost fern was a different kind of flower. It did not need the sun. It bloomed in the dark. It fed on the cold. It was the anti-poppy. He felt a desire to honor it, to render it with the same scientific precision he applied to the botanical specimens. He selected a fine-point eraser, a pencil eraser that could remove tiny areas of pigment. He used it to cut into the white pastel, creating sharp negative lines within the ice crystal. These were the internal fractures, the flaws in the gem. He drew with the eraser, removing light to create structure. Rub, blow, rub, blow. The white dust scattered across the desk, settling like a fine snow on the dark wood. He was creating a landscape of imperfections. A perfect crystal was boring. It was the flaws that caught the light that gave the ice its character. He worked on a small section where the fern branched, creating a chaotic jumble of fractured lines. It looked like shattered glass. It looked violent and beautiful. He leaned back, squinting at the drawing through half-closed eyes. This technique blurred the details, allowing him to see the overall values. The balance was good. The white shape was strong, dynamic, anchored by the dark umber roots and the charcoal shadows. It had a presence. It occupied the paper. He felt a draft across his ankles again. The cold floor was relentless. He pulled his feet up, resting them on the rungs of the chair, curling into a tighter ball. This position was precarious, balancing his center of gravity, but it removed his contact with the freezing floorboards. He felt slightly warmer. He was a bird on a perch. He picked up the blue pastel again. He wanted to add a cool cast to the outer edges of the paper, a vignette of temperature. He turned the stick on its side and swept it broadly across the corners of the sheet. The blue was faint, a whisper of atmosphere. He blended it with the rag, swirling it into the gray. The drawing now looked as if it were freezing from the outside in. The corners were cold. The center was, well, cold too, but a different kind of cold. A lit cold. He looked at the window. The frost was now a solid, opaque sheet. The room was sealed. He was inside the eye of the needle. He felt a strange sense of security. The snow could pile up to the chimney, the wind could scream, the temperature could drop to absolute zero. As long as he had the peat and the oil, he was safe. He was the keeper of the flame. He checked the oil level in the lamp again. It had dropped another fraction of an inch. He calculated the burn rate. He had enough for the rest of the night, which was an arbitrary concept here, and for the next. He had a reserve drum in the shed. He was wealthy in light. He picked up the white pastel. He returned to the spines of the fern. He wanted to make them sharper. He sharpened the pastel again obsessively until it was a lethal point. He touched the paper, dot. He dragged the point, line. He was suturing the light to the dark. He was sewing the ice. The repetition was hypnotic. His breathing slowed. His heart rate slowed. He was entering a state of hibernation, awake but metabolically depressed. The drawing was the only activity. The movement of his hand was the only output of energy. He was efficient. He was Arctic. He noticed a small smudge of blue on the white fern. A contamination. He frowned. He picked up the knife. He carefully scraped the surface of the paper, lifting the blue pigment away. He was performing surgery. He scraped until the white was pure again. Then he reapplied the white pastel, packing it down, sealing the wound. Perfect. He sat back. He took a sip of water. It was cold now. He held it in his mouth, warming it before swallowing. He looked at the drawing. It was nearly halfway done, or maybe a third. It was hard to tell. The ice was infinite. The paper was finite. He would draw until the paper was full or until he fell asleep. That was the rule. He looked at the shadow of the chair on the floor. It was long, distorted, stretching out toward the door like a reaching hand. It moved slightly as the flame flickered. It was a shadow puppet. He watched it for a moment, letting his mind drift. He imagined the shadow was a separate entity, a flat, dark creature that lived on the floor. It was a foolish thought born of isolation. He pushed it away. He returned to the reality of the desk. The texture of the wood, the smell of the wax and graphite, the sound of the wind returning, a soft, tentative whistle at the eaves. He picked up the pastel. He found his place on the paper. He resumed the work. The cycle continued. The cold, the light, the line. The tip of the charcoal pencil was a blunt, eroded cone of compressed wood ash. It moved across the surface of the dark gray paper with a sound that was less of a scratch and more of a dry, breathless whisper. It was the sound of friction between two prehistoric materials, the carbonized remains of ancient forests and the fibrous pulp of pressed rags. The botanist held the pencil loosely, his grip compromised by the creeping numbness in his fingertips. The sensation in his hands was a dull, buzzing static, a neurological signal that the blood flow was retreating, pulling back to the core to protect the vital organs. He did not fight this physiology. He accepted it as the cost of the work. He watched the black line emerge on the paper, a deep, velvety fissure in the gray void. He was darkening the negative space between the primary fronds of the ice fern. To make the white pastel sing, to make it glow with the illusory light of the frost, the surrounding darkness had to be absolute. It had to be a vacuum. He pressed down, increasing the friction. The charcoal crumbled slightly, leaving a small ridge of black dust along the edge of the line. He paused, lifting the pencil. He leaned forward, his face inches from the paper, and blew gently. PFFFT. The black dust scattered, drifting across the desk like a cloud of industrial smog, settling into the grain of the wood, into the cracks between the boards. He sat back, the vertebrae of his spine clicking one by one, a slow chain reaction of bone and cartilage readjusting to the vertical. The chair accepted his weight with a familiar, weary creak. He looked at his hands. They were stained. The fine lines of his palms, the deep creases of his knuckles, the cuticles of his nails, all were inlaid with the black dust of the charcoal. He looked like a coal miner who had never seen the sun. He rubbed his thumb against the side of his index finger. The skin was dry, papery, producing a rasping sound that seemed loud in the quiet room. He felt the grit of the carbon. It was a tactile connection to the element of life, reduced here to a tool of shadow. The wind outside had settled into a rhythmic thrumming, a low-frequency vibration that resonated in the heavy timbers of the cabin walls. It was not a chaotic gusting anymore. It was a steady, hydraulic pressure, as if the atmosphere had liquefied and was flowing around the structure like a deep, cold river. He could feel the weight of it. He could feel the immense, crushing solitude that extended for hundreds of miles in every direction. There was no one else. There was only the ice, the wind, and this small bubble of warm air. He turned his eyes to the lantern. The flame was a steady, yellow-orange tongue burning with a quiet determination. But the level of the oil in the glass reservoir had dropped dangerously low. It was a golden pool, barely covering the bottom of the wick. If he let it run dry, the wick would burn, the light would die, and he would be plunged into a darkness so complete it would feel like blindness. To reignite the lamp in the dark with frozen fingers was a struggle he did not wish to repeat. He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, a calculated expenditure of energy. He felt the stiffness in his knees, the resistance of the heavy wool trousers. He walked to the corner of the room where the supply chest sat. It was a heavy wooden box, reinforced with iron straps that had rusted to the color of dried blood. He knelt before it, the floorboards hard and unforgiving against his shins. He lifted the lid. The hinges shrieked, a sharp, metallic cry that cut through the silence. Inside, the smell of kerosene was stronger, a chemical, piercing scent that overrode the smell of peat and old wool. He reached in and retrieved the oil can. It was a rectangular tin vessel with a long, slender spout. It felt light. He shook it gently. Slosh, slosh. There was enough. He carried the can back to the desk, treating it with the reverence due a holy relic. He set it down on the wood. The metal clanked softly. He sat back in the chair. Now came the operation. He had to extinguish the flame to refill the reservoir safely. For a few minutes he would be in the dark. He prepared himself mentally. He memorized the position of the matches, a small wooden box to the right of the inkwell. He memorized the position of the lantern knob. He took a deep breath, inhaling the dry, heated air of the room. He reached out and turned the knob. The wick descended. The flame shrank, turning from yellow to blue, then to a tiny spark, and then nothing. The darkness was instantaneous and physical. It hit him like a wave of cold water. It was not just an absence of light, it was a presence of heavy, suffocating blackness. The room disappeared. The drawing, the desk, the stove, all gone. He was floating in a void. He remained perfectly still, listening. The sounds of the room were amplified in the dark. The ticking of the cooling stove metal, the scratch of the wind, the beat of his own heart. He counted to 10, letting his eyes adjust, though there was nothing to adjust to. He reached out in the dark, his hand moving with the memory of the space. His fingers brushed the cold glass of the lantern. He found the cap of the reservoir. He unscrewed it, squeak, squeak. The sound was reassuring. He lifted the cap and set it down. He picked up the oil can. He located the opening of the reservoir by touch, guiding the spout with his left forefinger. He began to pour. Glug, glug, glug. The sound of the oil flowing was viscous, heavy. The smell of kerosene intensified, filling his nose, a sharp hydrocarbon tang. He poured slowly, counting the glugs, estimating the volume. He could not see the level rising. He had to feel the change in the weight of the can, hear the change in the pitch of the pouring. It was a sensory exercise. When the pitch rose, indicating the reservoir was filling, he stopped. He tilted the can back. A single drop of oil fell onto the desk. Plip. He set the can down. He found the cap and screwed it back on. Squeak, squeak, secure. Now the resurrection of the light. He groped for the matchbox. His fingers found the rough texture of the striking surface. He pushed the box open and extracted a match. It was a wooden stick, fragile in his clumsy fingers. He held it against the box. Scritch fizz. The flare was blinding. A sudden, violent burst of sulfur and fire. He squinted against the glare, shielding his eyes. The match burned with a fierce, sputtering energy. He brought it to the lantern, opening the glass door. He touched the flame to the wick. The oil caught instantly. The flame jumped up, yellow and bright. He closed the door. The light steadied, expanding outward, reclaiming the room from the void. The desk reappeared. The drawing reappeared. The world was restored. He blew out the match, the acrid smoke of the sulfur mixing with the kerosene. He placed the burnt stick in the brass bowl, adding it to the pile of pastel dust, carbon to carbon. He sat for a moment, letting his pupils contract, letting his heart rate settle. The simple act of refilling the lamp was a reminder of his precarious position. He was dependent on a few inches of liquid dinosaur bones. He looked at the drawing. In the renewed light, it looked different. The black charcoal seemed deeper, the white pastel brighter. The interruption had refreshed his vision. He saw a section of the frost fern that needed attention, the transition zone where the crystalline structure dissolved into a smooth, amorphous sheet of ice. This required a blending of textures, a softening of edges. He picked up a gray pastel stick. It was a medium cool gray, the color of a clouded sky. He began to work on the transition zone. He used the side of the stick, applying broad, sweeping strokes that barely grazed the paper. He wanted to create a fog, a haze of ice that was neither solid nor gas. He layered the gray over the black background, letting the dark show through, creating a murky, translucent effect. He worked rhythmically, his hand moving in a pendulum motion. Sweep, sweep, sweep. The sound was soft, a gentle abrasion. He watched the gray dust settle on the paper. It looked like snow falling on a dark lake. He used his finger to smudge the dust, pushing it into the fibers of the paper. The heat of his finger melted the binder slightly, creating a smooth, painted look. He was painting with dust. He thought about the nature of ice. It was a mineral. It was a rock that melted at a temperature human beings found comfortable. To the planet, water was magma, ice was the crust. He was drawing the geology of the hydrosphere. He added a touch of white to the gray fog, creating swirls and eddies. These were the currents of the freezing air, captured in the solidifying water. He was mapping the turbulence of the atmosphere. The stove gave a sudden, sharp crack as a piece of coal shifted. The sound startled him, breaking his trance. He looked up. The stove was a black iron beast squatting in the corner. It demanded to be fed. He would need to add more peat soon, but not yet. He wanted to finish this section of the drawing first. He had a rule: never leave a section undefined. Chaos must be ordered before rest. He picked up the magnifying glass. He wanted to check the grain of the paper in the fog area. He brought the lens down. The gray smudge resolved into thousands of tiny particles of pigment clinging to the hills and valleys of the paper. It looked like a landscape of gray sand dunes. He saw a few specks of charcoal dust that had contaminated the gray. They looked like boulders in the sand. He used the tip of the kneadable eraser to lift them out. Tap, tap. The boulders vanished. The sand was pure again. He put the glass down. He looked at the window. The frost was unchanged, a solid white barrier. But he knew that on a microscopic level it was in constant flux. Molecules of water were sublimating, moving from solid to gas and then redepositing. The crystal was breathing. It was alive in a way that biology could not explain. He felt a deep respect for the ice. It was relentless. It was patient. It was beautiful. He reached for the mug of water. It was cold, the temperature of the room. He took a sip. The liquid felt thick, heavy. It tasted of the iron pot and the peat smoke. It was the taste of the cabin. He swallowed, feeling the cold slide down his gullet. He was drinking his environment. He picked up a white charcoal pencil, a different tool than the pastel. It was harder, grittier. It made a sharper line. He used it to draw the fine, crazed fractures that ran through the sheet ice. These were the stress lines, the scars of the thermal contraction. He drew them with quick, jagged strokes. ZZZZT. ZZZZT. The sound was sharper, more aggressive. He drew a web of cracks, a network of fragility. The ice looked ready to shatter. He enjoyed the tension between the soft, foggy gray and the sharp, white cracks. It was a visual representation of the physics of the cold, the softness of the snow and the hardness of the ice. He worked his way across the paper, extending the cracks until they met the edge of the fern. His eyes began to sting. The smoke from the stove, though mostly vented, still lingered in the room. A fine haze of particulate matter hung in the air, visible in the cone of lantern light. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his wrist, smearing a faint trail of charcoal across his forehead. He did not know it was there. He did not care. His appearance was irrelevant. There was no mirror, no audience. There was only the observer and the observed. He leaned back, stretching his legs under the desk. His boots bumped against the back panel. The sound was a dull thud. He wiggled his toes inside the boots. They were numb, distant appendages. He flexed his ankles, trying to pump blood down to his extremities. The cold was a rising tide. It started at the floor and worked its way up. He pulled his legs back, tucking them under the chair, away from the draft. He looked at the shelf of books. The gold lettering on the spines glinted in the lantern light. Principles of botany, Arctic flora. They seemed like artifacts from another life. A life of green things, of sun and soil and rain. Here there was no rain, there was only snow. There was no soil. There was only rock and permafrost, and the sun was a memory. He felt a wave of nostalgia, not for people but for color. For the green of moss, the red of a poppy, the blue of a summer sky. He looked back at his drawing. It was a study in monochrome, white, gray, black, blue, and a touch of ochre. It was the palette of the winter. He decided to add a touch of warmth, a memory of the sun. He picked up the yellow ochre pastel again. He looked for a place to put it, a reflection, a glint. He found a spot on the edge of the sheet ice where a crack caught the light of the lantern. He touched the paper with the yellow chalk, a tiny dot, a spark. He blended it slightly. It glowed. It looked like a tiny ember trapped in the ice. It was a symbol of the heat within the cabin, reflected in the cold outside. It was a symbol of his own resistance. He picked up the Prussian blue pastel. He wanted to deepen the shadows at the bottom of the drawing to ground the composition. He applied the blue heavily, pressing down until the stick crumbled. He created a deep, dark foundation of indigo. He blended it with the rag, pushing the pigment into the paper until it was a solid, opaque mass. It looked like deep water. It looked like the abyss. The wind shifted again, coming from the north now. A new draft found its way through a gap in the logs, a thin stream of freezing air that hit him on the left cheek. He flinched. The cold was hunting him. He reached for the scarf that hung on the back of the chair. It was a long, gray wool knit smelling of him. He wrapped it around his neck, tucking the ends into his coat. He pulled it up over his chin, burying his face in the wool. The draft was blocked. He was secure again. He returned to the drawing. The scarf limited his head movement, forcing him to turn his whole upper body to see different parts of the paper. It made him feel like a diver in a heavy suit. He liked the feeling. It was protective. He focused on the lower left corner of the paper. It was empty, a void of gray. He needed to fill it. He decided to draw a secondary formation, a small cluster of needle ice. These were sharp, straight crystals that grew like grass. He used the sharp edge of the white pastel. He made short, vertical strokes. Flick, flick, flick. A field of ice grass appeared. He varied the lengths, the angles. He made them cross each other, creating a dense thicket of crystal spikes. He added shadows with the charcoal pencil, drawing thin, dark lines between the white spikes. This gave them depth, separation. They looked sharp enough to draw blood. He imagined touching them, the sting of the cold, the brittle snap of the ice. He was creating a tactile world on a flat surface. He paused to sharpen the charcoal pencil. The knife sliced through the wood, slice, slice. The shavings fell. The smell of cedar rose. It was a sensory loop. Wood, smell, dust, line. He was caught in the loop, spinning slowly in the silence. He watched the shavings curl. They were like the wood's memory of growing, spiraling out from the center of the tree. He blew the shavings away. He checked the time on his internal clock. It felt like midnight or noon. It didn't matter. The drawing was progressing. The paper was filling up. He felt a sense of accomplishment. He was not just surviving, he was creating. He was making something beautiful out of the nothingness. He looked at the lantern again. The flame was steady. The oil level was safe. He had hours of light left. He settled deeper into the chair, the wool scarf scratching his chin. He picked up the white pastel. He looked at the needle ice. It needed highlights. It needed to shine. He brought the chalk to the paper. The work continued. The scratching sound resumed, a heartbeat in the void. The accumulation of the white pastel dust on the dark paper had become a geological feature in its own right. A miniature drift of pigment that mirrored the immense snowpack pressing against the exterior walls. The botanist watched the dust settle. It did not fall straight down. Rather, it obeyed the subtle, invisible microcurrents of air that circulated within the cabin, spiraling gently before coming to rest in the valleys of the paper grain. He blew gently on the drawing, a controlled exhalation meant to dislodge the loose particles without smudging the fixed lines. Whoosh! The dust lifted, a momentary blizzard in the cone of lantern light, before dispersing into the wider shadows of the room. He watched a single speck of white chalk float upward, caught in the thermal updraft of the lamp, rising until it vanished into the darkness of the ceiling, a tiny star swallowed by the night. He returned his attention to the needle ice formation he was rendering in the lower left quadrant of the sheet. These crystals were distinct from the fern-like structures above. They were columnar, sharp, aggressive. They grew straight out from the wood, defying gravity, driven by the intense pressure of the freezing moisture. To capture this, he had to change his grip on the pastel stick. He held it like a dagger, vertical and rigid. He pressed the tip into the paper and pulled it downward in a series of staccato strokes. Chick, chick, chick. The sound was different now, harder, more brittle. It was the sound of ice fracturing under the weight of a boot. He needed to convey the transparency of these needles. They were not opaque white. They were clear glass, visible only by the light they caught and the shadows they cast. He laid down the white lines, then immediately picked up the charcoal pencil to draw the shadows alongside them. The charcoal line had to be thinner than the white line, a mere hair's breadth of darkness that defined the edge of the crystal. He worked with microscopic focus, his eyes narrowing until the rest of the room dissolved into a blur of brown and gold. There was only the point of contact, the binary world of black carbon and white clay. He paused to flex his right hand. The cold had stiffened the tendons, turning his fingers into clumsy wooden appendages. He made a fist, squeezing tight until the knuckles turned white, then released. He repeated this 10 times, squeeze, release, squeeze, release. It was a mechanical maintenance routine, a way to force the sluggish blood through the capillaries. He felt a dull ache in his wrist, the repetitive strain of the drawing merging with the deep, penetrating chill of the air. He rubbed his wrist with his left hand, the friction generating a fleeting warmth that was quickly absorbed by the wool of his sweater. The silence of the room was heavy, stratified. The wind outside had shifted to a lower register, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated the floorboards beneath his boots. It was a sound that felt less like air and more like the earth itself groaning. He could feel the vibration traveling up through his legs, a low-frequency tremble that settled in his stomach. It was the sound of the pack ice grinding against the shore, miles away, transmitted through the frozen bedrock. It was a reminder of the immense forces at work in the dark. The ice was never truly still. It was always moving, crushing, reforming. He looked at the stove. The red eye of the draft vent had darkened to a sullen maroon. The heat output was dropping. The cycle of the fire was nearing its end. He would need to shake the grate and add more fuel. The thought was wearying. It involved movement, noise, and the disruption of his focus. But it was necessary. The temperature in the room was the only thing separating him from the frozen specimens in the jars. He pushed the chair back. The legs dragged across the uneven floorboards, a guttural sound that seemed too loud in the quiet. He stood up, his body unfolding slowly. He felt the stiffness in his back, the tightness in his hips. He walked to the stove, his heavy boots thudding dully. He picked up the iron shaker handle, a cold, heavy tool made of cast metal. He fitted it onto the nub of the grate. He began to rock it back and forth. Clank, crattle, clank, crattle. The sound was harsh, industrial. Inside the stove, the bed of ash was disturbed, falling through the grate into the pan below. He could hear the clink of the unburnt clinkers hitting the metal pan. He shook it until he saw the glow of the coals brighten through the vents. The ash cleared away to allow the air to reach the fire. He set the handle down. He took the iron hook and opened the stove door. The heat washed over him, a sudden dry wave that smelled of burning peat and ancient earth. The interior of the firebox was a landscape of glowing topography, hills of red coal, valleys of white ash, small blue flames licking at the edges. It was a miniature volcano. He picked up the tongs and selected 2 large blocks of peat from the scuttle. They were dry, fibrous bricks, the compressed history of a bog that had existed thousands of years ago. He placed them carefully into the fire, arranging them to allow for airflow. He did not throw them, he built the fire. It was an architectural task. He watched the peat for a moment. The edges began to smoke, then curled, then caught a small flame. The fire was renewed. He closed the door. The latch clicked shut. Clack. He adjusted the draft vent, opening it slightly to encourage the new fuel to burn. The stove began to tick again, the metal expanding with the rising heat. Tick, tick, tick. It was the metronome of his survival. He remained standing by the stove for a minute, soaking in the radiant energy. He turned his back to it, clasping his hands behind him. He looked at the room from this angle. The desk was a solitary island of light in the sea of shadows. The lantern cast a warm, golden pool on the wood, illuminating the papers, the jars, the pencils. Beyond that pool, the room faded into deep blues and grays. The corners were invisible. The ceiling was a vague darkness. It looked like a stage set for a play about solitude. His eyes fell on the bookshelf above the bunk. He saw the spine of a book titled Cryptograms of the Polar Regions. It was a thick volume bound in green cloth. He knew the plates inside, detailed lithographs of mosses and lichens. They were beautiful, scientific, precise, but they were printed. They lacked the texture of the original. His drawing, the one on the desk, had texture. It had the grit of the pastel, the grain of the paper. It was a physical object, not just a reproduction. He felt a flash of pride. He was creating a primary document. He walked back to the desk and sat down. The chair was still warm. He settled into it, pulling the blanket around his waist. He picked up the drawing board again. The needle ice section was half finished. He needed to add the background. The ice needles were transparent, so they would show the darkness of the wood behind them. But the wood was frosted, so it would be a gray-brown, not a deep black. He selected a stick of sepia pastel. It was a dark, warm brown, the color of dried kelp. He applied it lightly between the white vertical lines of the needles. He used the side of the stick, creating a broken, textured mark. He wanted to suggest the rough wood of the window sill, seen through a veil of ice. He layered a bit of gray over the sepia, cooling it down. The result was a murky, indeterminate color, the color of shadows in a frozen forest. He picked up the blending stump. He needed to push this background color back to make it recede behind the sharp white lines. He rubbed the paper between the needles, careful not to smear the white. It was a delicate operation, like weeding a garden of glass. He worked with slow, circular motions, grinding the pigment into the paper. The friction warmed the paper slightly under the tool. He could feel the change in drag as the pastel became smoother. He stopped to examine the tip of the blending stump. It was coated in a mix of brown, gray, and charcoal dust. It had become a drawing tool in itself. He used the dirty tip to add subtle shadows to the base of the needles, anchoring them to the sill. He was painting with the waste product of his previous marks. Nothing was wasted. Every particle of dust had a use. He looked at the window again. The frost had changed yet again. The needle ice in the corner had grown, the crystals lengthening, merging into a solid block. The distinct needles were gone, swallowed by their own growth. He was documenting a history that had already been erased. The drawing was now the only record of that specific formation. It was a memorial to a moment of crystallization. He felt a thirst. The dry air was relentless. He reached for the mug. It was empty. He had drunk the water earlier. He looked at the kettle on the stove. It was steaming gently. He should get more water. But he didn't want to move again. The inertia was heavy. He decided to wait. He would endure the thirst for a while. It was a small discomfort, easily compartmentalized. He picked up the white pastel again. He wanted to add a few stray crystals, tiny, isolated flakes of ice that had landed on the darker wood of the frame, separate from the main mass. These were the scouts, the pioneers of the frost. He sharpened the pastel to a fine point. He looked for the perfect spot on the paper, there in the lower right in the deep shadow of the frame. He touched the paper, dot. A single white speck. He looked at it. It was perfect, a lone star in the void. He added another dot, and another dot. He created a small constellation of frost. They were irregular, some larger, some smaller. He gave them tiny shadows with the charcoal pencil, making them sit on the surface of the paper. They looked like dust motes caught in a sunbeam, frozen in place. He found himself thinking about the nature of the hexagon. Why 6 sides? Why did water always choose this shape? He knew the chemistry, the hydrogen bonds, the angle of the molecule. But knowing the chemistry did not diminish the wonder. It enhanced it. It meant that the laws of the universe were consistent, even here at the edge of the habitable world. The same geometry that governed the honeycomb and the basalt column governed the snowflake. There was an order to things. He used the magnifying glass to inspect the stray crystals. Under the lens, the dots of pastel looked like jagged boulders of chalk. The charcoal shadows looked like pits in the earth. The illusion of the sphere broke down into the reality of the dust. He enjoyed this shifting perspective, the oscillation between the macro and the micro. It was how he passed the time, expanding and contracting his focus. He placed the magnifying glass back on the desk. Clink. The sound was dull, absorbed by the wood. He looked at the row of specimen jars. The alcohol in the jars was still liquid, but he noticed it was thicker, more viscous. It moved sluggishly when the wind shook the cabin. It was approaching its freezing point. If the alcohol froze, the jars would shatter. He would have to move them closer to the stove if the temperature dropped any further. He made a mental note. Watch the alcohol. He returned to the main body of the frost fern. He wanted to refine the texture of the largest frond. It looked too smooth. Real ice had ridges, striations, growth lines. He needed to add those. He took the white charcoal pencil, the hard one, and began to draw fine lines across the width of the frond. He curved them slightly, following the contour of the crystal. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The lines added tension to the shape. They made it look brittle under stress. He crisscrossed some of them, creating a mesh of fractures. He was aging the ice. He was giving it a history of thermal expansion and contraction. He worked slowly, deliberately, treating each line as a separate event. The wind outside gusted suddenly, a violent spasm that shook the entire cabin. The lantern swung on its hook, the shadows swaying wildly across the room. The botanist froze, his hand hovering over the paper. He waited. The cabin groaned, the timbers protesting the assault. Then the wind subsided, returning to its steady, low moan. The lantern settled. The shadows stopped dancing. The botanist resumed his work. He was not afraid. The cabin had stood for years. It was built of heavy timber bolted to the rock. It would hold. He had faith in the carpentry. He had faith in the geometry of the roof. He continued to draw, the scratching of the pencil the only answer to the wind. He looked at the cuff of his coat. The rough wool was fraying at the edge, a loose thread dangling. He resisted the urge to pull it. If he pulled it, the unraveling would begin. Entropy was always waiting for an opening. He tucked the thread back into the weave, smoothing it down. A temporary repair. Everything was temporary. He picked up the blue pastel again. He wanted to deepen the color of the fog he had drawn earlier. It was too pale. The ice fog of the Arctic was a deep, ominous blue-gray. He needed more pigment. He applied a layer of Prussian blue over the gray, pressing harder this time. The color went down rich and dark. He blended it with his finger, mixing it with the underlying layers. The result was a profound, suffocating color. It was the color of the sky at noon in midwinter, the color of no sun. He worked the blue into the corners of the paper, creating a vignette that focused the eye on the center. The darkness was closing in. The light was retreating. He was painting the claustrophobia of the polar night. He felt a grim satisfaction. The drawing was becoming emotionally accurate. It was not just a picture of frost. It was a picture of the feeling of frost. He wiped his blue-stained finger on the rag. The rag was becoming stiff with pigment. It was a heavy, dirty object. He folded it, finding a cleaner section inside. He cleaned his hands as best he could, but the blue stain remained in the cracks of his skin. He was becoming a part of the drawing. The drawing was becoming a part of him. He looked at the pencils in the tin tray. He counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They were all there. He liked to count them. It was a way of verifying reality. In the long dark, the mind could play tricks. Objects could seem to move or disappear. Counting was an anchor. 6 pencils, 1 knife, 1 eraser, 1 magnifying glass, the inventory of his life. He picked up the knife. He needed to sharpen the white pastel again. It had worn down to a nub. He opened the blade. He held the pastel over the brass bowl. He began to shave the chalk. The sound was a soft rasp. The white shavings fell, joining the blue and gray dust in the bowl. It was a mixture of all the colors he had used. A gray, nondescript pile. The sum of all the light and shadow was gray. He looked at the exposed tip of the pastel. It was fresh, clean, white, a new surface. He blew on it to remove the loose dust. He held it up to the light. It looked like a miniature stalactite. He was ready to continue. He looked at the drawing. There was a section near the top where the paper was still bare, a void in the composition. He decided to leave it for now. The negative space was important. It represented the unknown. The parts of the window he couldn't see because of the darkness. The parts of the world he couldn't see because of the winter. He would fill it later, perhaps with a reflection, or perhaps he would leave it dark. He felt the cold seeping through the seat of his trousers. The chair was cooling down. The heat from his body was dissipating into the wood. He shifted his weight, trying to find a warmer spot, but there was none. The cold was uniform. He accepted it. He was a warm object in a cold room. Thermodynamics dictated that he would lose heat. He pulled the blanket tighter around his waist. He picked up the charcoal pencil. He wanted to sign the drawing, not with his name, that seemed irrelevant, but with the date, or rather the estimated date. He thought for a moment. Was it November, December? He had lost track of the days. He knew the month by the light or the lack of it. It was deep winter. That was enough. He decided not to sign it. The ice had no name. The date was eternal. He lowered the pencil. He would add more texture to the mossy ice that surrounded the fern. He used a stippling technique. Tap, tap, tap. He created a field of tiny black dots in the white mist. It looked like dirt trapped in the ice. It looked like the gritty reality of the station. Soot, dust, ash. The ice captured everything. He worked patiently, dot by dot. The rhythm was soothing. It was like counting rosary beads. Each dot was a second of time frozen on the paper. He was banking time. He was storing his life in these graphite marks. Tap, tap, tap. The sound merged with the ticking of the stove and the moaning of the wind. A trio of solitude. He looked at the oil lamp. The level had dropped slightly since he refilled it. The consumption was steady. He calculated he had another 4 hours before he needed to worry. 4 hours of light, 4 hours of drawing. It was a lifetime. He took a deep breath. The air was dry, scratching his throat. He swallowed. He picked up the white pastel. He went back to the fern. There was a leaf that needed brightening. He touched the chalk to the paper. The line appeared. The work went on. The silence in the cabin had a viscosity to it now, a thick, fluid quality that seemed to slow the passage of light from the lantern to the corners of the room. The botanist felt this density. It was as if he were moving underwater, or perhaps suspended in a vat of clear, cold oil. Every motion required a deliberate push against the atmosphere. He sat at the desk, the drawing board before him, the gray paper now heavy with the accumulation of graphite and pastel dust. The image of the frost fern was dominant, a skeletal white structure floating in a dark, murky void. But there were still areas of the paper that remained untouched, raw gray fields waiting for the colonization of his tools. He reached for the brass compass that lay in the open drawer. It was a beautiful instrument, an artifact of navigation and geometry. The metal was dull, tarnished by the salt air of the voyage and the smoke of the cabin, but the mechanism was sound. He held it in his hand, feeling the weight of it. It was colder than the wooden pencils, colder than the paper. It was a conductor of the ambient temperature, a thief of heat. He warmed the hinge of the compass with his breath, a small cloud of vapor enveloping the brass for a second before vanishing. Hooah! The metal fogged, then cleared, leaving a faint sheen of moisture that froze instantly. He wanted to draw a perfect circle in the upper right quadrant of the paper, a representation of a frozen water droplet, a magnified sphere of ice that sat upon the flat glass. Nature rarely produced perfect circles, but in the microscopic world of surface tension, they existed. He adjusted the thumb wheel of the compass. The threaded rod turned with a smooth, oiled resistance. He widened the legs of the instrument until the steel point and the graphite lead were exactly an inch apart. He measured this against the ruler inlaid in the desk. Precision, accuracy, these were the anchors of sanity. He placed the steel point of the compass onto the paper. He pressed down gently, piercing the surface just enough to establish a pivot. He began to rotate the instrument. The lead traced a faint gray arc. He completed the revolution. A circle appeared. It was perfect. It was a boundary, a containment field for the next phase of the work. He lifted the compass and set it down. Click. The sound was sharp, definitive. He looked at the circle. It was empty, a gray hole in the composition. He needed to fill it. He needed to turn the flat circle into a sphere. This required a gradient, a smooth transition from light to dark that mimicked the curvature of the form. He picked up the white pastel. He sharpened it to a blunt, rounded tip, rubbing it against a scrap of sandpaper he kept tacked to the side of the desk. R-R-R-R-R-R-R-R. The sound was rough, abrasive. He began to apply the white pigment to the upper left side of the circle, the side facing the imagined light source. He pressed firmly, depositing a thick layer of chalk. Then he eased the pressure, letting the white fade into the gray of the paper as he moved toward the center. He picked up the Prussian blue pastel. He applied it to the lower right side, the shadow side. He curved his strokes, following the internal contour of the circle. Blue met gray. Gray met white. He set the pastels down and wiped his index finger on the rag. He needed a clean tool for blending. He examined his finger. The skin was stained, but the pad was relatively free of loose dust. He placed his finger on the paper, right at the junction of the white and the gray. He began to rub, swish, swish. He moved in small, concentric circles, spiraling inward. He blended the white into the gray, creating a soft, glowing highlight. He moved to the shadow side, blending the blue into the center. The flat circle began to bulge. It began to look heavy, three-dimensional. It looked like a marble made of ice. He leaned back to assess the illusion. It was successful. The sphere sat on the paper, reflecting the lantern light. He felt a sudden, sharp pang in his stomach, a contraction of the gut, hunger. It had returned, no longer a dull ache but a specific demand. He looked at his pocket watch, which lay on the desk. It had stopped hours ago. He didn't know the time, but his body knew. It was time to eat. He pushed the chair back. The wooden screech was a familiar protest. He stood up, his legs heavy and stiff. He walked to the shelving unit where the food supplies were kept. There was a tin of hardtack, dry, unleavened biscuits that were as hard as the oak of the desk. He pried the lid off the tin. The smell that escaped was faint, the scent of flour and dust. He reached in and took a biscuit. It was a round, thick disc, beige and unyielding. He walked back to the stove. He placed the biscuit on the warming plate of the stove top. He needed to heat it, not to cook it, but to drive out any moisture it might have absorbed from the air and to make it slightly less brittle. He watched it. The biscuit sat on the black iron, a pale moon on a dark sky. He turned it over after a minute. Clack. The sound of the hard bread hitting the metal was like a stone striking rock. While the biscuit warmed, he checked the kettle. There was still some water, but it was low. He would need to melt more ice soon. He poured a small amount of the hot water into his mug. He carried the mug and the warm biscuit back to the desk. He sat down. He broke the biscuit in half. It required significant force. Snap. The sound was loud, brittle, like a dry branch breaking in the winter woods. Crumbs fell onto the desk. He swept them away with his hand, careful not to let them fall onto the drawing. He dipped the edge of the biscuit into the hot water. He held it there for 10 seconds, counting silently. 1, 2, 3, 10. He lifted it out. The edge was softened, soggy. He ate. The taste was bland, elemental, wheat and water. It was fuel, nothing more. He chewed slowly, staring at the drawing. The rhythm of his jaw muscles worked against the silence. Crunch, chew, swallow. He ate the entire biscuit this way, dipping and eating, dipping and eating. It was a ritual of consumption, devoid of pleasure but full of necessity. He drank the remaining water. It washed the flour paste down his throat. The hunger subsided, replaced by a heavy, lethargic fullness. He brushed the last of the crumbs from his beard. He felt tired. The heavy meal, the warmth of the water, the hypnotic scratching of the pencils, it all conspired to pull him down into sleep. But he could not sleep yet. The drawing was not finished. The duty was not discharged. He shook his head, a physical rejection of the fatigue. He refocused his eyes on the sphere. He needed to add the reflection of the window in the sphere. Since the sphere was a convex mirror, it would reflect the room, distorted and curved. He picked up the charcoal pencil. He sharpened it to a needle point. In the upper left quadrant of the sphere, in the highlight area, he drew a tiny, curved trapezoid. This was the window. Inside the trapezoid, he drew a minute grid, the panes of the glass. And inside the panes, he added tiny specks of white, the frost on the window, reflected in the ice drop. It was a drawing within a drawing, a fractal recursion. He held his breath as he made the marks. They were microscopic. He was operating at the limit of his visual acuity. He drew the reflection of the lantern, a tiny dot of yellow ochre next to the window. He drew the shadow of the compass, a thin, curved line of darkness. He exhaled. The cloud of breath obscured the paper for a moment. He waited for it to clear. He looked at the sphere through the magnifying glass. It was a world, a tiny, frozen planet containing a distorted map of his entire existence. He felt a strange sense of vertigo. If he looked deep enough into that drawn reflection, would he see himself? A tiny, charcoal man sitting at a tiny desk. He put the glass down. He needed to work on the background of the upper section. The void. It couldn't just be flat gray paper. The air in the room had texture. The darkness had grain. He decided to use a cross-hatching technique with the 2H graphite pencil to build up a subtle, vibrating tone. He began to draw lines, long, diagonal strokes that spanned the width of the open space. Swish, 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 swish. The sound was like dry grass rustling in the wind. He kept the lines perfectly parallel, spacing them a millimeter apart. He covered the entire upper area with this diagonal rain of graphite. Then, he rotated the board slightly and began to cross them with lines running the opposite direction. The mesh of lines created a gray tone that was darker than the paper but lighter than the charcoal. It shimmered slightly as he moved his head, the graphite reflecting the lantern light. It looked like a weaving. It looked like the fabric of the night. He found the repetition deeply soothing. It required no decision-making, only execution. Line after line after line. It was a form of meditation. The wind outside picked up again, a sudden rising crescendo that battered the north wall. The cabin shuddered. A draft of cold air ghosted across the floor, swirling around his ankles. He felt the chill penetrate his socks. He curled his toes, trying to preserve the warmth. The temperature was dropping. He could feel it in the stiffness of the paper, in the way the pastel dust clung to the surface. The world was freezing harder. He looked at the window. The frost was now so thick it looked like a slab of marble. There was no glass visible, only the white, crystalline geology of the ice. It had encroached on the frame, growing over the wood, sealing the gaps. The cabin was being consumed. He was living inside a geode. He returned to the drawing. He wanted to add a halo around the ice sphere, the glow of the light refracting through the moisture in the air surrounding the drop. He took the white pastel and pulverized a small amount of it on a separate sheet of paper, turning it into a fine powder. He dipped a clean cotton ball, one he kept in the medical kit, into the powder. He touched the cotton ball to the paper surrounding the sphere. He dabbed gently. Pat, pat, pat. A soft, nebulous glow appeared around the ice drop. It looked ethereal, radioactive with cold. He blended the edges of the glow into the cross-hatched background, letting the graphite show through the white dust. The interaction of the two textures, the sharp, metallic lines of the pencil and the soft, matte dust of the pastel, created a complex atmospheric effect. It looked like moonlight on a spider web. He paused to clean the graphite from his hands. He rubbed them on the rag. The rag was now black with carbon. He turned it over, but there were no clean spots left. It was a saturated object. He resolved to wash it or replace it, but not now. Now the dirt was part of the process. He accepted the stain. He was marked by his work. He looked at the row of glass jars again. He was worried about the alcohol. He stood up, taking the lantern with him. He walked to the shelf where the specimens sat. He held the light up to the jars. The fluid was thick, syrupy. In the jar containing the Saxifraga oppositifolia, the purple petals hung suspended in the gel-like liquid. A small crystal had formed at the bottom of the jar. The freezing had begun. He acted quickly. He moved the jars one by one to the floor near the stove. It was the warmest place in the room, relatively speaking. He arranged them in a semicircle around the cast iron legs, careful not to place them too close to the heat, which might crack the glass. Clink, clink, clink. The jars settled on the wood. The specimens were safe for now. They would sleep by the fire. He returned the lantern to its hook above the desk. The shadows swung back into place. He sat down. The disruption had broken his rhythm, but only slightly. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was the caretaker. He protected the flowers, both the dead ones in the jars and the drawn ones on the paper. He picked up the eraser. It was a block of gum rubber, hardened by the cold. He held it in his hand for a moment, warming it, kneading it until it became pliable. He wanted to use it to create negative lines in the cross-hatched background, streaks of light cutting through the darkness. He pressed the edge of the eraser to the paper and dragged it through the graphite mesh. Rub, a pale line appeared, erasing the pencil marks, revealing the gray paper underneath. Rub, he drew another. He was drawing rays of light. He angled them so they seemed to emanate from the reflected lantern in the ice sphere. It was a subtle effect, barely visible, but it added a layer of interaction between the objects in the drawing. The light was active. It was traveling. He brushed the eraser crumbs away. They fell like rubber snow. He looked at the floor. The area around the desk was littered with the detritus of the night. Wood shavings, pastel dust, eraser crumbs, hardtack crumbs. It was a microcosm of debris. He would sweep it in the morning. For now, it stayed. He felt the fatigue pressing behind his eyes, a dull, throbbing pressure. He closed his eyes for a moment. The afterimage of the drawing burned in his retina, a negative image where the white ice was black and the dark paper was bright. He watched the afterimage fade, dissolving into the swirling patterns of phosphenes. He saw geometric shapes, grids, spirals. The architecture of the mind mimicking the architecture of the ice. He opened his eyes. The room was still there. The wind was still there. The drawing was still there. He picked up the charcoal pencil. He wanted to darken the shadow cast by the ice sphere. A sphere sitting on a surface casts an elliptical shadow. He drew the ellipse, stretching it out to the right, away from the light. He filled it in with heavy, dense strokes. Scritch, scratch. The shadow anchored the sphere. It gave it weight. Gravity existed on the paper. He blended the edges of the shadow, making it soft and fuzzy. Shadows were never sharp in this diffused light. They were pools of darkness with indeterminate boundaries. He worked the charcoal into the grain of the paper, obliterating the texture, creating a void. He noticed that the tip of the charcoal pencil was wearing down unevenly, creating a flat, chisel-like edge. He used this to his advantage. He turned the pencil and used the broad edge to make wide, blocky marks in the lower corner of the paper, suggesting the rough texture of the wooden window sill. He was building the environment around the ice. The ice did not exist in a vacuum. It existed in a context of wood and air. He looked at the thermometer again. The temperature had dropped another degree. The battle against the entropy of the universe was a losing one, but a slow one. He had time. He wrapped his coat tighter around himself. He pulled the wool hat down over his ears. He was a bundle of insulation, a warm core protecting a consciousness. He looked at the tin tray of pencils. The 2H graphite pencil he had used for the hatching was now shorter than the others. It had given its length to the drawing, a sacrifice of graphite. He aligned it with the others, creating a descending stair-step pattern in the tray. Order. Always order. He took a sip from the mug. The water was cold now, unpleasantly so. He drank it anyway. He needed the hydration. The air was sucking the moisture out of his skin, out of his eyes, out of his lungs. He was desiccation in slow motion. He placed the mug back on the coaster. He picked up the sepia pastel. He wanted to add a touch of warmth to the shadow of the sphere, reflecting the brown of the wood it sat upon. He glazed a thin layer of brown over the black charcoal. It warmed the shadow, making it rich and deep. It was a subtle color shift, one that perhaps only he would notice. But he noticed, and that was enough. He leaned back, resting his head against the high back of the chair. He looked at the ceiling, at the dark planks above. He imagined the snow piling up on the roof, layer upon layer, a white blanket thickening with every hour. He imagined the weight of it, tons of snow. Silent, heavy, cold, it was a comfort in a way. He was buried, he was hidden. The world could not find him here. He brought his gaze back to the desk. The sphere was finished. The fern was finished. The needles were finished. The drawing was nearing completion. But there was still the empty space in the bottom right corner, a triangle of gray that needed purpose. He considered what to put there. Another crystal, a fallen leaf, a tool. He decided on a single fallen petal of the frost, a shard that had broken off the main fern and lay flat on the sill, a ruin. It would represent the fragility of the structure. He picked up the white pastel. He began to draw the shard. It was jagged, irregular, a piece of broken geometry. He drew it quickly with sharp, angular strokes. It lay flat, lacking the volume of the sphere or the height of the fern. It was debris. He added a faint shadow underneath it, lifting it slightly off the surface. It looked sad. It looked like a discarded thought. He smoothed the surface of the shard with the blending stump, making it glassy and slick. He added a tiny highlight on the edge, a glint of the lantern. It was a diamond in the dust. He was satisfied. The composition was balanced now. The heavy fern on the left, the sphere on the top right, the shard on the bottom right. A triad of forms. He felt the wind shift again, dropping to a low, barely audible murmur. The silence returned, deeper than before. The cabin settled into the snow. The stove ticked. The botanist breathed. In, out, in, out. The vapor rose. The drawing waited. The night continued. The air in the cabin had achieved a quality of stillness that was almost geological. It was no longer merely the absence of wind or movement. It was a heavy, stratified presence, layer upon layer of cold nitrogen and oxygen settling into the depression of the room. The botanist felt this weight resting against his chest, a subtle pressure that made each inhalation a conscious effort against the density of the atmosphere. He sat slumped slightly in the wooden chair, his posture dictated by the conservation of heat and energy. His chin was tucked into the rough wool of his scarf, his shoulders hunched to minimize the surface area exposed to the cooling air. The lantern above him burned with a dogged, silent persistence, its flame a solitary vertical element in a world that sought to flatten everything into horizontal layers of snow and ice. On the desk, the drawing lay open and vulnerable, a rectangle of gray paper that had absorbed the hours of his night. The shard of ice he had begun to render in the lower right corner was taking shape, but it remained incomplete, a ghostly outline of potential form. He picked up a stick of hard white pastel, a different tool from the soft chalk he had used for the fern. This stick was compressed, dense, capable of holding a sharp edge. He held it like a scalpel. He intended to define the fractured plane of the ice shard, the sharp, jagged facet where it had sheared away from the main crystal. He brought the pastel to the paper. The contact was silent. He applied pressure, dragging the hard edge across the grain, scree. The sound was high-pitched, a microscopic screech of friction. He drew a straight, harsh line that cut through the soft gray background. It was the edge of the fracture. It had to look sharp enough to cut skin. He drew a second line, intersecting the first at an acute angle. Geometry. The violence of the break was encoded in the angles. He stared at the intersection, his eyes watering slightly from the strain and the smoke. He needed to create the illusion of thickness. The shard was not a two-dimensional shape. It was a slab of frozen water with volume. He picked up the gray pastel, the one the color of a winter cloud. He applied it to the side of the shard, creating a small vertical wall of gray. This was the edge of the ice, the thickness of the sheet. He blended it gently with the tip of his little finger, pushing the dust into the paper until it looked smooth and uniform. He looked at his finger. It was coated in gray dust. He wiped it on the rag, adding another smudge to the archive of the night's work. The stove ticked in the corner, a sound of contracting metal. The heat was receding. The thermal envelope of the cabin was shrinking, pulling back toward the iron box. The botanist felt the cold creeping up his legs, past the wool socks, past the leather boots, seeking the warmth of his blood. He wiggled his toes. They moved sluggishly, remote operators at the end of long, cold cables. He considered standing up to pace, to generate heat through motion, but the inertia was too strong. The chair held him. The drawing held him. To move was to break the spell of the concentration. And in this solitude, the concentration was the only thing that kept the vastness of the Arctic from rushing into his mind. He focused on the texture of the wooden window sill in the drawing. The shard of ice was lying on wood. He needed to render that surface. He picked up a graphite stick, a rectangular block of pure graphite without a wood casing. He turned it on its broad side. He dragged it across the bottom of the paper underneath the ice shard. Ar-ar-ar-ar-ar-ar-ar-ar. The sound was low, rumbling. The broad stroke created a wide band of gray texture, skipping over the valleys of the paper, hitting the peaks. It looked like rough-hewn timber. It looked like the grain of the very desk he was sitting at. He layered the graphite, building up the darkness. He wanted the wood to look old, weathered, stained by years of condensation and frost. He took the sepia pastel and added streaks of brown into the graphite. The two materials mixed on the paper, creating a dirty, organic color. It was the color of decay. It contrasted perfectly with the sterile, white purity of the ice. Life and anti-life. Wood and water. He used the sharp corner of the graphite block to draw the cracks in the wood, the fissures where the timber had split from the dryness. He drew them with jerky, irregular lines. He was mapping the microscopic topography of the sill. He added a knot in the wood, a swirl of dark graphite that looked like a black eye staring up at the ice. The wood was watching the frost. He paused to drink from the mug. The water was now completely cold. It had equalized with the room temperature. He took a sip. It was refreshing in a stark, utilitarian way. It tasted of the stone jug it had come from. He swallowed, feeling the liquid travel down his esophagus, a cold snake moving through his core. He set the mug down. He looked at the window of the cabin. The frost had changed again. The fern formation was now burying itself under a new layer of plate ice. The intricate details he had spent hours drawing were being erased by the relentless accumulation of the storm. He was documenting a ghost. The realization did not sadden him. It justified the work. If he did not draw it, it would be gone forever, unseen by any other human eye. He was the witness, the sole observer of this specific configuration of water molecules. He picked up the magnifying glass and held it over the drawing of the shard. He wanted to add internal fractures to the piece of ice. Ice was rarely perfect. It was full of stress lines, bubbles, trapped air. He used the white charcoal pencil to draw tiny, suspended dots inside the shard. Dot, dot, dot. These were air bubbles, ancient atmosphere trapped in the freeze. He drew a few hairline cracks radiating from the center of the shard. It looked brittle. It looked real. He put the glass down. He needed to sharpen the white charcoal pencil. The tip was dull. He picked up the knife. He held the pencil over the brass bowl. The metal blade bit into the wood, slice. The sound was crisp. A curl of cedar fell into the bowl, slice. Another curl. The smell of the fresh wood was sharp, piercing the stale air of the room. It was a smell of forests, of sunlight, of places where the sap ran liquid. He inhaled it greedily, closing his eyes for a second to transport himself to a sawmill in a green valley. Then he opened his eyes, and the gray walls returned. He blew the dust from the pencil point. It was needle-sharp. He returned to the paper. He wanted to highlight the upper edge of the shard, the ridge that caught the lantern light. He pressed the sharp white point onto the paper and drew a single, unwavering line along the top of the ice fragment. It popped. The contrast between the bright white line and the dark background made the ice look three-dimensional. It sat on the paper, a solid object. He leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck with his left hand. The muscles were hard, knotted with tension. He tilted his head from side to side. Crack, crack. The vertebrae signaled their relief. He looked at the shadows in the corner of the room. They seemed to have moved closer, encroaching on the circle of light. The darkness was a fluid, rising like a tide. He looked at the lantern. The flame was slightly smaller now, the wick consuming the oil at a steady rate. It was a visual timer, counting down the duration of his wakefulness. He decided to work on the negative space again, the area between the shard and the main fern. It was a channel of darkness. He wanted to make it deep, abyssal. He picked up the charcoal stick, a thick, round rod of compressed willow charcoal. It was the blackest tool he owned. He applied it to the paper, pressing hard. The charcoal crumbled, depositing a thick layer of velvet black dust. He filled the gap between the ice forms. He was painting with night. He used the rag to blend the charcoal. He rubbed vigorously, generating heat, forcing the black dust into the very fibers of the paper. The gray disappeared. The paper disappeared. There was only the black void. It absorbed the light. It was a window into the nothingness outside. He worked carefully around the white edges of the ice, ensuring that the black did not contaminate the purity of the frost. It was a boundary dispute between light and dark. He stopped to look at his hands. They were filthy. Black soot covered his fingers, his palms, his wrists. He looked like a stoker on a steamship. He felt a strange satisfaction in the grime. It was proof of effort. It was the residue of creation. He rubbed his hands together, the charcoal acting as a dry lubricant. The sound was a soft, sandy rustle. He looked at the shelf where the books lived. He imagined the words inside them freezing on the pages, the ink contracting, the paper stiffening. Did knowledge have a freezing point? Did stories become brittle in the cold? He shook his head slightly, dismissing the fanciful thought. It was the fatigue speaking, the mind wandering, seeking patterns in the static. He heard a sound from the floor, a soft tink. He looked down. One of the specimen jars near the stove had shifted. The heat from the iron legs had melted a thin layer of the alcohol gel, and the jar had slid a fraction of an inch on the uneven floorboards. He watched it. It was still. The specimen inside the saxifraga floated motionlessly. It was safe. The system was working. He returned his gaze to the drawing. He wanted to add a glint to the blackest part of the shadow, a reflection of a reflection. Sometimes light bounced in unexpected ways, illuminating the deepest dark. He took the blue pastel and made a faint, barely visible mark in the charcoal void, a whisper of indigo. It suggested that even in the deepest shadow there was still information. There was still color. It was the blue of the deep glacier, hidden from the sun. He worked on the transition between the wood texture and the black background. He wanted the wood to fade into the dark, to be swallowed by the shadow. He used the charcoal pencil to darken the edges of the graphite texture, blending the brown and gray into the black. The wood sill seemed to extend endlessly into the dark, a plank leading into the void. The wind outside began to moan again, a low, mournful sound that rose and fell in pitch like a siren. It was the wind finding a new edge on the ice pack, fluting across a ridge of pressure ridges. The cabin responded with a sympathetic vibration. The lantern swayed gently. The shadows on the paper moved, changing the perception of the drawing. The ice seemed to shift. The shard seemed to slide. The botanist placed his hand on the paper to steady it, though it was not moving. He was steadying his perception. He felt the cold of the desk through the back of the paper. The cold was the substrate of the art. He was drawing on a block of frozen wood. He picked up the white pastel again. He wanted to refine the snow texture on the wood sill. In reality, fine powder snow often sifted through the cracks and settled on the interior wood. He wanted to capture that. He tapped the pastel stick against his finger, letting fine white dust fall onto the drawing in the area of the wood texture. Tap, tap, tap. A light dusting of snow appeared on the graphite timber. He did not blend this dust. He left it sitting on the surface. It looked fresh, loose. If he blew on it, it would vanish. It was impermanent, just like the real snow. He sealed it with a fixative of will. He decided not to touch it again. It was finished. The snow had fallen. He looked at the compass. He picked it up and closed it. The legs folded together with a smooth, oiled resistance. He placed it back in the drawer. He was done with geometry. The rest of the work was organic, chaotic. It was about entropy and growth. He looked at the thermometer. The mercury was holding steady at 48 degrees. The stove was fighting a stalemate. He would need to add fuel soon, but he wanted to finish the shard first. He had a rule about interruptions. Finish the form, then tend the fire. He picked up the eraser. He cleaned the edge of the shard, erasing a smudge of charcoal that had crossed the line. He wanted the edge to be razor sharp. He rubbed carefully, removing the gray haze, revealing the bright paper, or rather, the lighter gray paper underneath. He used the white pastel to re-establish the line. Sharper, colder. He leaned in close, his nose almost touching the paper. He could smell the charcoal, the chalk, the wood, the wax. It was the smell of the studio. It was a comforting scent, a civilized scent. He inhaled it deep into his lungs, displacing the smell of the kerosene and the peat. For a moment, he was not in the Arctic. He was in a classroom. He was in a study. He was anywhere but here. Then the wind gusted, rattling the door in its frame, and he was back. He was in the box. He was in the white waste. He pulled back from the paper. He looked at the drawing as a whole. The composition was locking into place. The balance of light and dark was working. The eye moved from the fern to the sphere to the shard, traveling a triangle of ice. He felt a cramp in his right shoulder, a sharp knot of muscle that burned. He dropped his arm, letting it hang by his side. He shook it out. The blood rushed down into his fingertips, causing a pins and needles sensation. He gritted his teeth. The body was a failing machine. It required constant maintenance. He rolled his shoulder, hearing the crunch of the joint. He looked at the magnifying glass. He picked it up and examined the texture of the charcoal in the deep shadow. It looked like a landscape of black boulders. He saw the fibers of the paper struggling to hold the pigment. He saw the microscopic glint of the graphite underneath. It was a chaotic, messy world down there, but from a distance, it looked like silence. He put the glass down. He picked up the yellow ochre pastel. He hesitated. Should he add a glint to the shard? No. The shard was too low, too deep in the shadow of the frame. It would not catch the lantern light. It should remain cold, blue-white. He put the yellow pastel back. Restraint, accuracy, these were the virtues. He picked up the blue pastel instead. He added a faint wash of blue to the base of the shard where it touched the wood. The ice was absorbing the darkness of the wood and the cold of the air. It was a transition zone. He blended it softly. It looked wet. It looked like the ice was just beginning to melt or just beginning to freeze. The ambiguity was pleasing. He checked the time on his internal clock again. It felt later. The weight of the night was heavier. The air was thinner. He felt a yawn building in his chest, a deep, expanding pressure. He fought it down. To yawn was to admit defeat. He clenched his jaw. He focused on the tip of the white pastel. He wanted to add a few more grains of frost to the wood, tiny, isolated crystals that had grown on the rough grain. He dotted the paper with the white chalk. Dot, dot, dot. He varied the pressure, making some bright, some faint. He was populating the landscape. He was sowing the seeds of the ice. He thought about the seeds he had in the storage locker, seeds of wheat, of barley, of peas. They were frozen, dormant, waiting for a sun that was months away. They were time travelers waiting to wake up in a different season. He felt like a seed himself, encased in a hard shell, waiting for the ship, waiting for the thaw. He shook his head. Focus. The drawing. He looked at the shard. It was done. It looked sharp, cold, broken. It told a story of fracture and gravity. It was a tragedy in miniature. He sat back. He wiped his hands on the rag. The rag was now a heavy, stiff testament to the work. He laid it across his knee. He looked at the stove. It was time. The red eye was dim. The heat was fading. He had to move. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly. He walked to the stove. The movement was a chore. He opened the door. The coals were low, a bed of dying stars. He reached for the peat. He put 2 blocks in. He watched the smoke. He closed the door. He adjusted the vent. He stood there waiting for the heat to return. He looked at the specimen jars on the floor. They were glowing faintly in the light from the stove vent. They looked like votive candles. He checked the papaver. It was still floating, still safe. He walked back to the desk. He did not sit immediately. He stood looking down at the drawing. From this height, it looked almost photographic. The texture of the paper disappeared. The illusion of the ice was complete. He felt a surge of validation. He had captured it. He had stolen a piece of the winter and trapped it on paper. He sat down. The chair welcomed him back. He picked up the white pastel. There were still details to refine. The night was not over. The wind was still singing. He was still awake. He brought the pastel to the paper. The scratching resumed. The atmosphere within the cabin had thickened, condensing into a palpable medium that blurred the boundaries between the air and the solid objects it surrounded. The botanist sat immersed in this heavy, gelatinous silence, his physical form feeling less like a body of flesh and blood, and more like a dense, stationary object anchored to the wooden floor by the sheer weight of the cold. The lantern light, now burning with a deep, amber hue as the wick slowly carbonized, did not so much illuminate the room as stain it with a dull, antiqued gold. The corners of the cabin had receded completely into the void, the wooden walls dissolving into a soft, velvety blackness that seemed to possess a gravitational pull, drawing the heat and the mind toward the perimeter. He sat with his forearms resting heavily on the desk, the wool of his sleeves flattening against the hard oak. The drawing board lay before him, a rectangle of captured winter in a sea of dark wood. The composition was largely established: the great frost fern, the crystalline sphere, the shattered shard. But the space between these objects, the ether of the drawing, remained unfinished. It lacked the density of the real air. It was too empty, too clean. The air in the Arctic was not empty. It was filled with diamond dust, with moisture, with the unseen pressures of the magnetic pole. He needed to render the atmosphere itself. He reached for the container of pastel dust he had created earlier, the brass bowl filled with the shavings of white, blue, and gray chalk. The mixture had settled into a strata of color, a miniature geological formation of pigment. He did not want to disturb the layers. He wanted to use the finest, lightest particles that sat on the top, the flower of the pastel. He picked up a large, soft brush made of badger hair. It was a tool he rarely used, reserved for sweeping away eraser crumbs, but tonight it would be a painting instrument. He touched the tip of the brush to the surface of the dust. Dip. He did not scoop. He merely allowed the static charge of the bristles to attract the pigment. A faint, ghostly coating of pale blue-gray powder adhered to the hairs. He brought the brush to the paper. He held it perpendicular to the surface, hovering an inch above the drawing. He tapped the handle of the brush gently with his index finger. Tap, tap, tap. The dust fell. It drifted down like a micro snowfall, settling onto the dark gray paper in a random, natural distribution. It landed on the black charcoal shadows, on the white ice forms on the bare paper. It created a veil, a unifying layer of cold mist that softened the harsh contrasts and tied the disparate elements together. He watched the dust settle. It was a slow process, governed by the resistance of the air. He held his breath, fearing that even a gentle exhalation would create a hurricane on the surface of the paper and scatter the snow. When the dust had settled, he examined the effect. The drawing looked frozen. It looked as though it had been left outside for an hour. The sharp lines of the fern were now seen through a haze, giving them a sense of distance and mystery. The black shadows were no longer abyssal voids. They were filled with the faint, suspended particulate of the polar night. It was atmospheric perspective applied to a still life of ice. But the dust was loose. It was fragile. If he moved the board, it would shift. He needed to fix it, to press it into the tooth of the paper without destroying the delicate texture. He placed the brush down. Clack. He pulled a fresh sheet of glassine paper from the drawer, a smooth, translucent material used to protect drawings. He laid the glassine gently over the drawing, watching the milky transparency obscure the image. He took the back of a spoon, a silver tablespoon he kept for his meals, and used it as a burnishing tool. He rubbed the back of the spoon over the glassine paper, applying firm, even pressure. Rub, rub, rub. The sound was a low, smooth friction like a sled gliding over hard-packed snow. He worked in circles, spiraling outward from the center. He was pressing the pastel dust into the fibers of the gray paper, trapping it under the pressure. He was fossilizing the snow. He worked for 10 minutes, covering every square inch of the drawing. His arm ached with a dull, repetitive throb, a sensation that merged with the cold in his shoulder joint. He ignored it. The pain was just a signal. The work was the reality. He finished the burnishing. He lifted the glassine paper slowly, peeling it back from the corner. The static electricity made a faint crackling sound. Crinkle. The reveal was satisfying. The dust was now part of the surface. The drawing had a smooth, matte finish like the surface of a frozen pond. The atmosphere was locked in. The haze was permanent. He looked at the glassine paper. It held a faint, ghostly reverse image of the drawing in loose dust. He crumpled it up, crunch, and tossed it toward the stove. It landed on the floor, a ball of translucent trash. He looked at the lantern. The flame had dipped lower. The shadows on the wall had lengthened, stretching up to the ceiling like dark fingers. The oil was being consumed. The time was passing. He felt the weight of the silence pressing against his eardrums, a physical sensation of fullness. It was the sound of blood rushing in the capillaries of the inner ear, a high-pitched whine that was the only counterpoint to the low moan of the wind. He needed to deepen the vignette effect. He wanted the edges of the paper to be almost black, forcing the eye to the center where the light hit the ice. He picked up the large chunk of compressed charcoal again. He applied it to the very corners of the paper, pressing so hard that the charcoal squeaked. Scree. He laid down a thick, heavy layer of carbon. He wanted the corners to look like they were dissolving into the darkness of the room. He used his thumb to blend the charcoal. He pushed the black dust inward, creating a gradient that faded from pure black to dark gray to the misty blue of the center. His thumb was numb, a callous pad of dead skin pushing against the paper. He could not feel the texture anymore. He could only see the result. The darkness encroached. The light retreated. It was a metaphor for the winter itself. He paused to look at the window. The frost was absolute. There was no outside world. The cabin was a capsule floating in a white void. He imagined the landscape beyond the wall, the endless ridges of pressure ice, the sastrugi sculpted by the wind, the black leads of open water steaming in the cold. It was a hostile, alien planet, and he was the astronaut stranded in his wooden ship, scratching images of the alien geology onto paper. He felt a shiver start at the base of his spine and ripple up to his neck. The cold had found a way in. It had breached the defenses of the wool and the leather. He pulled the collar of his coat up, covering his ears. He tucked his hands into his armpits, hugging himself to reclaim some warmth. He sat there for a minute, a huddled shape in the dim light, rocking slightly back and forth. Rock, rock. It was a primal comfort, a movement of the cradle. He looked at the stove. The red eye was dim. The heat was a faint memory. He had to move. He had to feed the beast. He unwrapped his arms. He pushed himself up. The chair slid back with a harsh scrape. He walked to the stove, his steps heavy and stiff. He opened the door. The fire was dying. The coals were gray, covered in ash. He felt a spike of anxiety. Had he waited too long? If the fire went out, relighting it would be a desperate struggle. He grabbed the poker and stabbed at the coals, breaking the crust of ash. Crunch. Stir. A faint orange glow appeared in the center. It was still alive. He breathed a sigh of relief, a plume of vapor escaping his lips. He took the last 3 blocks of peat from the scuttle. He placed them carefully onto the glowing spot, building a small pyramid of fuel. He leaned down and blew on the coals. Woo-whoa. The ash flew up into his face, coating his beard in gray dust. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound. But the oxygen did its work. A small blue flame licked at the bottom of the peat. It caught. The fire was saved. He closed the door. He adjusted the draft to maximum. He needed heat, and he needed it now. He stood by the stove, rubbing his hands over the metal top, feeling the warmth slowly return. He looked at the specimen jars on the floor. They were still liquid. The system held. He walked back to the desk, but stopped at the bookshelf. He pulled out a volume, The Voyage of the Erebus. He didn't open it, he just held it. The leather was cold, frozen stiff. He ran his thumb over the gold lettering on the spine. It was a tactile connection to the history of exploration. He was part of a long line of men who had sat in the cold and documented the emptiness. He put the book back. Thud. He sat down at the desk. The movement was automatic. The chair was his station. He picked up the white pastel. He looked at the drawing. It needed highlights. The burnishing process had dulled the brightest whites. He needed to re-establish the sparkle of the ice. He sharpened the pastel to a lethal point. He looked for the sharpest edges of the fern, the points where the crystal lattice turned to catch the light. He touched the paper. Dot. A tiny, brilliant speck of white. Dot. Another one. He was turning on the lights in the city of ice. He worked his way across the drawing, adding micro-highlights. He added a glint to the rim of the sphere. He added a spark to the fractured edge of the shard. He added a shimmer to the needle ice. The drawing began to vibrate with light. It looked cold. It looked sharp. It looked dangerous. He focused on the agate formation, the concentric rings of ice. He added a thin, broken line of white along the top of each ridge. Dash, dash, dash. It defined the form, giving it a terrace-like structure. He could imagine walking on those terraces, a microscopic explorer climbing the cliffs of the frost. The wind outside shifted again, dropping to a low, barely audible whisper. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of the grave. The botanist stopped moving. He stopped breathing. He listened. He could hear the hiss of the oil in the lamp. He could hear the tick of the cooling metal of the compass in the drawer. He could hear the friction of his own clothes as he breathed. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of insignificance. He was a speck of carbon in a universe of ice. His drawing was a smudge of dust on a piece of pulp. Does it matter? The question floated in the cold air. Does any of this matter? He looked at the drawing. The ice fern glowed in the lantern light. It was beautiful. It was complex. It was perfect. Yes, it mattered. To record the beauty was the only defiance against the oblivion. To see the structure was to deny the chaos. He gripped the pastel tighter. The work mattered. He decided to add a ghost reflection in the dark glass of the window background, a faint, indistinct shape that suggested his own reflection. He used the gray pastel, applying it so lightly that the mark was almost invisible, a smudge of a shoulder, the curve of a head. It was not a portrait, it was a shadow of a presence. He blended it into the background until it was barely there. He was haunting his own drawing. He wiped his hands on the rag. The rag was stiff, heavy with the night's labor. He folded it carefully, treating it like a precious textile. He placed it on the left side of the desk. He picked up the magnifying glass. He wanted to inspect the stippling he had done earlier, the field of dots in the mist. He brought the lens down. The dots looked like stars in a galaxy. He saw the space between them, the gray paper grain, the texture of the void. He felt a sense of vertigo falling into the microscopic space. He pulled back. He rubbed his eyes. They were dry, gritty. He blinked rapidly, trying to summon moisture, but his tear ducts were parched. He reached for the water mug. It was empty. He looked at the kettle. He didn't have the energy to get up again. He would endure the thirst. It was part of the discipline. He picked up the 4B graphite pencil. He wanted to darken the very center of the ice sphere, the pupil of the eye. He pressed the point into the paper, rotating it slightly. Grind. He made a dense black dot. It anchored the sphere. It gave it a focal point. He looked at the pencils in the tray. They were shorter now. They had given their lives for the image. He felt a strange affection for them. They were his crew. They were his tools of navigation. He ran his finger along the tops of the pencils, feeling the painted wood. Smooth, cold, reliable. He looked at the frost on the real window. It had grown even thicker. The patterns he had been drawing were now buried deep under new layers. The drawing was a history of an hour ago. The present was already different. The ice was faster than the hand. He felt a draft across the floor. The wind had found a new way in. He shifted his feet, pulling them up onto the crossbar of the chair. He curled into a ball. The cold was a predator circling, looking for a weakness. He tightened his scarf. He pulled his sleeves down. He was a fortress. He picked up the white pastel again. He wanted to add a few floating crystals in the air above the fern, tiny flakes of diamond dust that were falling in the stillness of the room. He tapped the pastel against his finger, letting the finest dust fall onto the upper part of the drawing. He did not blend it. He did not touch it. He let it sit there, loose and free. He looked at the result. It looked like magic. It looked like the air was freezing in real time. He smiled, a small, cracking movement of his dry lips. It was a good effect. He checked the oil level. It was critical. The bottom of the reservoir was barely covered. The flame was starting to flicker, gasping for fuel. He had perhaps 20 minutes of light left, 20 minutes to finish. The deadline was physical. He did not panic. Panic was a waste of oxygen. He focused. What was left? The signature? No. The edges? Yes. The edges of the paper needed to be defined. He wanted the drawing to float on the sheet, not to bleed off the edge. He took the eraser and cleaned the margins of the paper. He erased the stray smudges, the fingerprints, the test marks. Rub, rub, rub. He created a clean, sharp border of gray paper around the image. It framed the frost. It isolated it. It made it a specimen. He swept the eraser crumbs away with the badger brush. Swish, swish. The desk was clean. The drawing was framed. He leaned back. He looked at the work. It was heavy. It was cold. It was silent. It was almost done. He felt a deep, crushing fatigue settle over him. His eyelids felt like lead shutters. His head felt too heavy for his neck. He wanted to sleep. He wanted to let the fire go out and sleep in the cold. But not yet. There was one last thing, one last detail. The center of the fern, the heart of the ice. It needed something, a final spark. He picked up the yellow ochre pastel. He held it in his hand. He looked at the center of the white explosion. He hesitated. Was it too much? Was it necessary? He looked at the lantern. The flame sputtered, dipping low, then flaring up. It was a sign. The light was dying. The ice needed to remember the light. He brought the ochre to the paper. He touched the very center of the fern, dot. A tiny, warm heartbeat in the middle of the cold. He blended it softly. It glowed. It was the soul of the drawing. He put the pastel down. He sat back. He breathed. The steam rose from his mouth, a gray cloud in the dying light. He watched it rise. He watched it fade. The wind moaned. The stove ticked. The ice waited. He looked at the drawing. It was ready for the end. He was ready for the end. The final part was coming. The sleep was coming. He rested his hands on his knees. He closed his eyes for a second just to rest them. The darkness behind his lids was full of white lines, the afterimage of the frost. It was burned into his mind. He opened his eyes. The room was darker. The flame was lower. The shadows were taller. He was alone in the box. He was alone in the world. He picked up the white pastel one last time. He held it. He waited. The single dot of yellow ochre sat in the center of the frost fern, a microscopic sun trapped in a galaxy of ice. The botanist stared at it. His eyes were burning, the lids heavy and granulated with fatigue, but he could not look away. The color was vibrating. In the monochromatic world of the cabin, that tiny speck of earth tone was a shout. It anchored the entire composition, pulling the eye inward past the white spikes, past the blue shadows, down into the warm, imaginary heart of the crystal. He felt a profound sense of finality settle over him, a heavy, woolen blanket of completion that draped across his shoulders and weighed down his hands. The drawing was finished. To add another mark would be to ruin it. To erase a mark would be a sin. It existed now, separate from him, an object in the world with its own gravity and its own silence. He slowly lowered the pastel stick to the wooden tray. It made a soft, final click against the tin. He looked at his hand. It was suspended in the air, trembling slightly, a biological tremor born of exhausted muscles and the creeping cold. He lowered his hand to the desk, letting it rest on the wood. The sensation of the grain was familiar, grounding. He was a man sitting at a desk in a wooden box at the end of the world. The geography was simple. The geometry was absolute. He took a deep breath, inhaling the complex atmosphere of the room. It was a layered scent, the sharp, metallic tang of the ozone from the snow, the heavy, oily smell of the kerosene, the dry, dusty scent of the peat ash, and the faint, underlying odor of old paper and graphite. It was the smell of his life. He held the breath for a moment, letting the oxygen circulate, then exhaled slowly. The vapor cloud was thin, ghostly, vanishing almost instantly into the shadows. The room was cooling. The thermal envelope was shrinking. He reached for the sheet of glassine paper he had used earlier. He smoothed it out on the desk, pressing out the crinkles with the side of his hand. He picked up the drawing board. He held it vertically for a second, tapping the edge against the desk. Tap, tap. A final shower of loose pastel dust fell from the paper, settling on the wood like gray snow. He laid the board back down. He placed the glassine over the drawing. The image softened, becoming a memory of itself, seen through a fog. He opened the large portfolio that leaned against the leg of the desk. It was made of heavy black cardboard, the corners reinforced with leather. He untied the black ribbon that held it closed. The knot was stiff, resisting his clumsy fingers. He worked at it patiently, picking at the loops until the ribbon gave way. He opened the cover. Inside lay the stack of his winter's work, a dozen sheets of gray paper, each separated by a sheet of tissue. He lifted the current drawing, handling it by the very edges of the board. He placed it gently on top of the stack. He lowered the cover. He retied the ribbon. The work was entombed. It was safe. He sat back in the chair. The sudden absence of the drawing left a void on the desk. The pool of lantern light fell on empty wood, illuminating the scars and stains of the oak. He felt a strange sense of loss, followed immediately by a wave of relief. The duty was discharged. The observation was recorded. He was free to rest. He looked up at the lantern. The flame was dying. It was no longer a steady tongue of fire. It was a blue, sputtering pulse that clung desperately to the charred wick. The oil reservoir was dry. The last drops of kerosene were being vaporized, converted into heat and light in a final act of consumption. The light in the room was pulsing in rhythm with the flame, bright, dim, bright, dim. The shadows on the walls were jumping, expanding and contracting like breathing lungs. The room was gasping. He watched the death of the light with a detached, scientific curiosity. He counted the pulses. 1, 2, 3. The interval between them was lengthening. The flame was starving. He did not move to refill it. There was no need. The work was done. The day or the waking period was over. It was time for the dark. He watched the flame shrink to a tiny blue bead. It hovered there for a second, a single point of combustion, and then, with a faint, audible pop, it vanished. The darkness that rushed in was absolute. It was a physical weight, a collapse of the visual world. For a moment, he was blind. The afterimage of the flame burned in his retina, a green spot floating in the black void. He sat perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust. Slowly, the absolute blackness softened into a deep, impenetrable gray. The only source of light now was the stove. The vents in the iron door glowed with a dull, sullen red, staring into the room like the eyes of a deep-sea creature. The light was weak, barely reaching the desk, but it was enough to orient himself. He could see the outline of the stovepipe, the vague shape of the bunk, the glint of the brass thermometer. The temperature seemed to drop instantly with the loss of the light. It was a psychological effect, but it felt physical. The lantern had provided an illusion of warmth. Now, there was only the cold truth of the Arctic night. He felt the draft from the floor wrapping around his ankles, a cold fluid rising to submerge him. He pushed the chair back. The sound of the wood dragging on the floor was loud in the silence. Scrap. He stood up, his knees locked, stiff and painful. He placed his hands on the small of his back and arched his spine, hearing the wet crunch of the vertebrae. He was a structure of bone and gristle, hardening in the cold. He stood in the dark for a moment, swaying slightly, finding his center of gravity. He began the ritual of the stove. It was the final duty before sleep, the most critical task of the cycle. If the fire went out while he slept, he might not wake up, or he would wake up to a room so cold that relighting the fire would be a task of immense, shivering difficulty. He walked to the coal scuttle, navigating by memory and the red glow of the vents. He picked up the heavy iron poker. He hooked the door of the stove and pulled. Creak. The hinges complained. The door swung open, revealing the interior of the firebox. The bed of coals was low, a landscape of glowing embers covered in a blanket of gray ash. The heat hit his face, a sudden, dry kiss. He squinted against the infrared radiation. He picked up the shovel. He dug into the scuttle, bypassing the large blocks of peat he used during the day. He sought the slack, the dust and small crumbs of peat that settled at the bottom of the bin. This fine material would pack down over the coals, smothering the fire just enough to slow the burn rate, creating a slow, smoldering heat that would last for hours. He shoveled the slack into the stove. Shhh clatter. The dust fell onto the coals, dimming the glow. A cloud of smoke puffed up, smelling of ancient earth. He added another shovel, and another. He was burying the fire. He was putting the stove to sleep. He smoothed the top of the pile with the back of the shovel, creating a flat bed of fuel. He closed the door. Clang. The sound rang out, a heavy iron note that signaled the end of the day's industry. He adjusted the circular draft vent, screwing it down until it was almost closed, leaving only a sliver of an opening for oxygen. The stove began to tick slower. The roar of the draft quieted to a low, rhythmic murmur. Hum, hum, hum. He turned away from the stove. The room was now very dark, illuminated only by the faint red leakage from the vents and the seams of the iron box. The darkness was textured, grainy. He could see the dust motes dancing in the red light, tiny red sparks floating in the air. He walked to the specimen jars he had placed on the floor. He knelt down, his joints cracking. He touched the side of the nearest jar. It was cool but not freezing. The liquid inside was thick, moving like syrup when he tipped the jar, but it was not crystalline. The papiver floated in its suspended animation. He decided to leave them there in the thermal shadow of the stove. They were the refugees of the station, huddled around the last heat source. He stood up and walked to the bunk. It was a built-in wooden platform against the far wall, filled with a mattress of straw and covered with layers of heavy wool blankets and a reindeer skin. It was his nest. It was the only place in the world where he could be warm. He began to undress. This was a slow, reluctant process. Every layer he removed was a loss of insulation. He unbuttoned his heavy wool coat. The buttons were large, made of bone, and his fingers were clumsy. He fumbled with the top button, pushing it through the stiff buttonhole. It popped free. He worked his way down. 1, 2, 3, 4. He shrugged the coat off. The weight of it left his shoulders. He hung it on the peg by the door. It looked like a hanged man in the gloom, a dark, empty shell. He kept his thick sweater on. To sleep without it was madness. He kept his scarf on, loosening it slightly but leaving it wrapped around his throat. The neck was a vulnerability. He sat on the edge of the bunk to remove his boots. This was the hardest part. The leather was stiff with cold, the laces frozen into rigid loops. He picked at the knots, his fingernails scraping against the hardened hide. He worked the laces loose inch by inch. He grasped the heel of the left boot and pulled. It resisted. He pulled harder, grunting with the effort. Thump. The boot came off, hitting the floor with a heavy, dead sound. He peeled off the outer sock, a thick, felted wool sheath. He left the inner sock on. His foot felt light, exposed. He rubbed his ankle, feeling the indentation of the boot cuff. He repeated the process with the right boot. Thump. The second boot joined the first. They stood together in the dark, silent sentinels waiting for the morning watch. He swung his legs up onto the mattress. The straw rustled beneath him, a dry, whispering sound that reminded him of summer fields he could barely remember. He pulled the blankets up. There were 3 of them, thick, gray, scratchy navy issue wool. On top of them was the reindeer hide, the fur facing inward to trap the air. He burrowed under the layers. The weight was immense. It pressed him down into the mattress, immobilizing him. It was a comforting weight, a crushing security. He pulled the blankets up over his chin, over his nose, leaving only his eyes and forehead exposed to the room air. He felt the cold shock of the sheets against his legs, but he knew that in a few minutes his body heat would create a microclimate, a bubble of warmth trapped by the wool. He lay on his back, staring up at the darkness. The ceiling was invisible. The walls were invisible. He was floating in a sensory deprivation tank, anchored only by the weight of the blankets and the sound of the wind. The wind had not stopped. It never stopped, but it had changed. It was no longer a threat, it was a lullaby. It was a low, continuous drone that wrapped around the cabin, smoothing out the edges of the world. He listened to the variations in the pitch. The deep bass of the gusts hitting the south wall. The high, thin whistle of the draft in the eaves. It was a complex, chaotic music. He closed his eyes. The afterimages of the drawing were still there, drifting in the darkness behind his lids. He saw the white spikes of the frost fern. He saw the blue shadows. He saw the yellow dot. They were burning into his memory, becoming part of his internal landscape. He realized that he knew the frost better than he knew his own face. He had studied it, measured it, drawn it. He had become it. His breathing slowed, in, out. He could hear the air moving through his nostrils, a dry, rhythmic sound. He could feel the moisture of his breath condensing on the wool blanket covering his nose. It would freeze there during the night, forming a crust of ice, a frost garden of his own making. He let his mind drift. He thought about the seeds in the storage locker. The peas, the beans, the wheat, they were sleeping just like him. Their metabolism had slowed to almost zero. They were waiting for the signal. The sun, the thaw, the water. He was a seed. He was dormant. He was waiting for the ship. But the ship was a distant, abstract concept. It belonged to a different time scale. For now, there was only the cycle of the stove and the lamp, the wakefulness and the sleep, the white and the black. He felt his muscles relaxing, one by one. The tension in his neck released. The knot in his shoulder uncoiled. The stiffness in his legs melted away. He was sinking into the mattress, becoming heavy, becoming liquid. The boundary between his body and the bed began to dissolve. The cold on his face was sharp, biting. It was the only thing that kept him tethered to consciousness. He focused on the sensation, the cold tip of his nose, the cold skin of his forehead. It was a clean sensation. It was pure. It was honest. He heard the stove settle, clink, a piece of coal shifting in the cooling firebox. It was a friendly sound, a domestic sound. It meant the fire was holding. It meant the guardian was awake while he slept. He thought about the drawing in the portfolio. It was safe in the dark. It would not melt. It would not fade. It was a permanent record of a fleeting moment. He felt a deep satisfaction. He had done his work. He had kept the watch. The darkness of the room seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. It was a slow, steady rhythm slowing down with every minute. 50 beats per minute, 45, 40. He was entering hibernation. He imagined the snow outside falling in the dark. Millions of flakes, each one a masterpiece of geometry, piling up on the roof, banking against the walls. The cabin was being buried. It was becoming part of the landscape, a wooden stone in a river of ice. He felt the sleep rising up to meet him. It was not a falling sensation, it was a rising one. A dark, warm tide washing over his mind. It covered his feet, his legs, his chest. It reached his neck. He took one last conscious breath. The air was cold, tasting of wool and smoke. He held it for a moment, savoring the stillness. Then he let it go. Whoosh. The breath joined the atmosphere of the room. The mind released its hold on the present. The botanist drifted away, leaving the frozen world behind. He floated into the gray, textureless void of dreamless sleep, where there was no cold, no hunger, no duty, only the silence. The stove ticked, the wind moaned, the frost on the window grew crystal by crystal in the dark. A new fern began to form in the upper corner, a spiral of white ice that no one would see. It grew in the silence, perfect and indifferent. And the night continued. And the ice held. And the silence was complete.